You know it's this. Take a perk and talk it and see. Money swallowed like sis. They done perfected the kid. Got a billion who take on my hate. Nothing better. Put out the road I just spent. I know we got $1 million. The devil, they shit ain't not cheaper than
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to MangaMuse. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the fourth part of What If Naruto Joined Star Wars? Special note, this fanfic is written in a masterpiece of NeonZangetsu on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. 3 days later, Uzumaki Naruto found himself standing in a small room of the Theed Temple in which the deaths of heroes were mourned, and their lives celebrated. Tomorrow there would be a celebration in honor of his and Qui-Gon's triumph over the Sith Lord known as Darth Maul. These last 3 days had been spent in remembrance of the dead and those fallen in battle. For there had been a battle, and during that short-lived dogfight before his son had taken out the droid control ship, numerous Gungans and Naboo were slain. He paced the room, dressed in fresh clothing for the occasion. Gone were his weapons and armor, everything secreted away in a small scroll on his personage. Clad in his dark robes, he looked almost like the contrast to a Jedi Knight, filled with emotion, eager and impatient for his guest to speak with him so that he might depart and return to his family and cherish what he still had. Indeed, for the sage it was a sobering thing, knowing that so many had died thanks unto his actions. Probably why the people of this planet wanted to celebrate. They wanted to put the sadness and sorrow behind them and move on with all of their lives. Now that Nute Gunray and Rune Hako had been brought to justice, happy times were ahead. It would be a grand gala, culminating in a parade celebrating the Gungans' unification with the Naboo, and their subsequent triumph over this oppression. Rumor had it that the Jedi Council would also be in attendance as well according to his sources within the temple conferring knighthood upon obiwankenobi. Apparently Qui-Gon's conviction had shaken them to their very foundations, or, barring that, they felt the need to mollify him for aiding in the defeat of the Sith Lord. The thought of it almost made Naruto laugh, almost broke him from his rueful reverie. The boy, in his opinion, was a bit brash, headstrong perhaps, downright foolish, even. But if he survived the next decade he'd become a fine Jedi. Perhaps even a tad like his master. A fine Jedi indeed. Tradition had been eschewed here many times already, but that wasn't why he was here. His reasons for pacing in the Temple of Theed alone and unprotected stemmed from a different reason altogether. One of the Jedi Masters, oddly enough, wished to speak with him in private. He hadn't given his name, only that he wished to congratulate the blonde for his supreme efforts against Maul. Personally, such a request had intrigued him, and so here he was, unarmed, save for the hilts of his lightsabers at his belt. Yes, hilts. The other belonged to Ayla Secura. In his mind, it always would. Oh, the Twi'lek was alive and well for certain, still recovering from a few broken bones in a back-to-tank back in the infirmary. She'd refused all attempts to return it, claiming she would construct a new one. Moreover, she'd wanted him to have it. Naruto understood full well the reasoning behind this seemingly innocuous action and its implications, and he didn't want to think about them right now. There was simply too much on his mind. Such as our mysterious patron? Kurama inquired. Something like that, yes, Naruto admitted. He probably wants to speak with us about that Sith we killed. He could feel the ice in his partner's reply. VERYYYY. Just like Ayla spoke with us. Will you quit being such a horn dog? I'm not. The fox snapped. But even a cross-eyed Jawa could see that she's head over heels for you. You think I don't know that? His reply could have melted Durasteel. And what would you have me do, anyway? In case you haven't forgotten, let me lay it out for you. I am married, with a kid, and another on the way I might add. What kind of example would I set for them if I decide to just enter into another relationship? Even if SHMI is alright with it. That's not for me to decide. The old fox replied. I can poke and prod all you like, but in the end, it's your decision. Sure, right, then. No pressure. Don't mind me, I just may not break your heart. Unbidden, he flashed back on the aftermath of the battle, when everything had become so hopelessly tangled. Flashback. You want me to keep this? Ayla nodded, wincing at the spasm of pain the motion elicited in her aching back. Naruto said nothing. He stood over her in the medbay, her body laid out on a long cot, her head propped up by innumerable pillows. The physician had already given his final say in the matter. She would be fine. A bit of bed rest was needed to soothe her torn muscles, that was all. There was an ugly purple bruise forming on her neck where Maul nearly force-choked her to death. But with time, as all things often did, the marks would fade. Naruto, being the kind soul that he was, had come to visit her. And then she dropped this on him. Naruto regarded the hilt clutched in his hand, this seemingly innocuous cylinder of metal belonging to his longtime friend and ally. She was giving it to him. Him, of all people. He could sense her very thoughts and emotions in this weapon. In that instant, he knew this was her first lightsaber. The Force spoke to him then, showcasing all this weapon had been through in all its years, the countless nicks and scratches garnered on words beyond the outer rim, lovingly maintained, but never replaced. It was like cradling her very soul. Ayla, I can't. He shook his head. This weapon's important to you. Keep it. She would not be dissuaded. I want you to. That weapon saved your life today. Who knows what it might do tomorrow. So keep it by you, always. Knowing that, I can build an even better one. Her smile did her no justice, that she even had the strength to be cheery after the beating she'd endured. It was something of a miracle in and of itself. Something flickered in her gaze then, and without thinking, he probed at her through the Force. The resultant flood of emotion nearly floored him. Cautiously, tentatively, she was displaying it, like the war-torn hishiate he kept wrapped around his neck. Not just friendship, something more than that, so bright he could barely bring himself to look at it. No, it stunned him. I never thought of you that way, he said mentally, letting the Force convey the essence of the message as best his limited control in this department could. Nor I you. But things change. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and the weight of her own despair threatened to choke Naruto where he stood. Wait, too late. He felt her defenses slam shut, an iron wall concealing the truth. As I said, she told him, I want you to keep it. Please. She sounded tiny and fragile in that moment, as though anything he might say would shatter her entirely. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm tired. Her head lowered to the pillow as her eyes closed. So too was their discussion. For now, in the end, he left the medbay with more than just a guilty conscience that day. Then flashback. Women. Why did they have to be so complicated? For the life of him, Naruto could not bring himself to remember when Ayla had fallen in love with him. He wasn't even sure when it had happened. Or why, for that matter. Had it been something he'd said? Something he had done differently? Or had she simply decided to act on these feelings after nearly being killed by the Sith? Naruto didn't know. He only knew that he had to do something about it. But the question was what? He wasn't even sure how he felt on the matter himself. He certainly respected her as a comrade and an individual, but more. Honestly, he'd never considered it. On and on these thoughts ran in an endless feedback loop until he could take it no more. 3 days had passed since he'd spoken to her last, 3 days of silence. What would his answer be? Unable to think of it for an indefatigable period of time, his attention shifted back to the root cause of all this. Maul. That aside, there was a certain perverse pleasure to be had, having been the one to deal the final blow to Maul. Not just once, but twofold. Not only had he avenged the injury SHMI suffered back on Tatooine, but he'd struck a blow against the misconceived notions of the Council. They couldn't bear the thought of an untrained Force user like himself taking down a deadly Sith. It probably rankled even more than that forcible timeout he'd given them back at the temple. And now by order of the newly elected Supreme Chancellor, they were forced to congratulate him for it. Oh, sweet irony. Under any other circumstance the Shinobi Menace would have been all but cackling with delight. But tonight, on the eve of what proved to be his most monumental celebration to date, thoughts of irony remained far from our favorite blonde's mind. His mind wasn't even with his wife and son, tucked away safely in their ship, under the watchful photoreceptors of HK-47, Vet and Set, alongside a handful of clones. No, he knew that his dysfunctional little family could quite take care of themselves until he sorted this out. And so he stood, and shifted his focus to a more pleasant, yet equally disturbing topic. The Sith. He stood there in the temple, his brain still baffled by the information he'd gained from Maul. He had been surprised by the sheer volume of it, different techniques, manners in which he might improve his control. Even the passcode to his infiltrator hidden a few clicks south of the royal palace. But where his enigmatic master was concerned, there had been very little information. It was as if a series of psychic blocks had been erected within Maul's mind. Even with the almighty powers of the Rinnegan at his beck and call, Naruto had only been able to break through a handful of them, before the strain fried the Zabrak's brain and ended him. But he'd gotten enough. His Sidious, Coruscant, Senate. Darth Sidious was someone of great political power, someone who dwelt on Coruscant, someone who potentially controlled the very Senate itself. Doubtlessly the dark man from Naruto's visions, the man who would one day, if not stopped, tempt his son to the dark side and end everything. Vague though these strange clues might be, they narrowed his search considerably, leaving only a handful of individuals who might benefit from all this chaos, used to their advantage. Chief amongst them their newly elected Supreme Chancellor, Palpatine. He'd had his suspicions of the man to begin with, but to act on them, to expose this supposed Dark Lord in hiding, he would need proof. Gone were the days of this gung-ho killing. This wasn't a simple job where he could just assassinate the man and be done with it. Nor was it as if he could just stroll into the man's office and lop off his head for the suspicion of being a Sith Lord, either. Satisfying though it might be, he couldn't risk such a foolish mistake. Couldn't risk the lives foe his family on a hunch. But he had his ways of obtaining proof. Oh, yes, chief amongst them. The doors opened with a gentle nudge of the Force, cutting off that thought. Jedi Master Dooku appeared with a flourish, those crisp footfalls giving him away almost immediately. Intrigued, the Shinobi Menace momentarily ceased his pacing and stared, perplexed by the man's grand entrance. That was usually his SH tick. Naruto recognized him at once, and how could he not? He'd seen him in countless holodramas and documentaries. This was the greatest lightsaber duelist the Order had ever known, bar none save Master Yoda. So this was the one who had requested a private audience with him. I apologize for the wait, he spoke, his grand voice swelling across the open antechamber. There were matters of grave importance that required my undivided attention. Naruto said nothing, he merely nodded in Dooku's direction. He wasn't a man of imposing stature, but there was certainly something to be said about him as he entered the room. His long stride seemed to devour the distance between them. His loose-fitting sand-colored garb a singular staple that did nothing to detract from his imposing aura. Spots of gray could just be seen within his hair and beard, another silent sign of age creeping up on him. Within the next decade, all traces of color would likely be gone altogether. He is an aging man, older even than Qui-Gon, long since past his prime, but still powerful nonetheless. You are Naruto, I trust? He asked, straight to the point. The one and only. Dooku smiled. Excellent, he said. Then I'll try not to bore you. The blonde made a noise of assent, to which the former count continued. I confess, I have looked forward to and anticipate this day for quite some time. His head inclined demurely, the slightest gesture of respect. Qui-Gon has always spoken most highly of you. Well. This was new. A Jedi who actually respected him. Why do you know? I take it you didn't call me down here just to tack about all bushy beard. Naruto grunted. I did not. Dooku confirmed. In fact, I wanted to thank you. In person, Dooku admitted. That brought the menace up short. Thank me for saving the life of my former pupil, the master explained surreptitiously. While I acknowledge that Qui-Gon was, and is an expert duelist in his own right, he was clearly no match for the Sith that you faced. I must admit I would have likely left the Order had he passed on. In fact, I am still considerate. You see, Dooku suddenly looked terribly, horribly weary. In my old age I find myself growing quite tired of this endless bureaucracy, the ceaseless politicking, tireless strife. It's refreshing to see someone such as yourself take action. Before I leave, well, Naruto admitted, I'm flattered. And he was. After all the good he'd done for the galaxy, it was nice to hear someone congratulating him, even if it was a Jedi. He warily permitted himself a small smile. Just what did Dooku want with him, anyway? I recently heard of your little debacle in the temple. Here to chew me out on it? The blonde challenged. Quite the contrary, the Count replied. I wish to congratulate you. It is my firm belief that Order that to which I have devoted my entire life and being has grown stagnant, decayed, that they now stoop to kidnapping children from unwilling parents disgusts me. You were right to stand up to them, and by rights, Master Yoda. I understand you demonstrated your prowess with a lightsaber at the time. Yeah, that aside, I'm rather curious to see your swordsmanship for myself. In other words, a duel. Naruto frowned. When it came to a no-holds-barred contest, with full access to all of his techniques and bounty hunter training, he was certain he could take Dooku. But a straight-up duel. He'd never fought a master head-on before without relying on his extra skills. Why did the man wish to test him so badly? He noted something in that instat, that Dooku's lightsaber featured a curved handle, all the better to angle his strikes in and out, and catch his opponents unawares. The mark of a true duelist. So you want to fight me without my armor? Dooku was quick to mollify his suspicions. Just a friendly spar, nothing more. Besides, even if I were to maim you, you would heal, would you not? Naruto frowned at that one. How the Jedi learned of his regeneration served only to intrigue him further. While it was true nothing short of direct atomization at the cellular level could outright kill him, just the same he wasn't looking forward to feeling the searing bite of a lightsaber upon his flesh for a second time this week. But never one to back down from a challenge. What would his son think? The hunter decided to grant the aging Jedi's request. Very well, he decided, thumbing the hilts of each lightsaber. I suppose I could do with a good workout. You favor two sabers, the master noted. In a way, yes. Interesting. Dooku ignited his lightsaber and snapped off a perfunctory salute, raising the blazing blue blade to his forehead. First to 3 points wins. Make it 4. Naruto shot back. Wouldn't want to make it too easy for me. A muscle jumped in the man's jaw, but nothing more. Very well. With a move as blinding as it was fast, Dooku pounced, reaching forward with a stabbing lunge. Although the aging Jedi was faster than one might expect from such an old man, Naruto was still considerably more nimble than his adversary. Dodging to his left, he drew and activated both his and Aila's sabers in a single motion. Then he shifted them into a reverse grip, leaving the blades pointing away from his opponent as he leaned in forwards. His body crouched low and toward the ground. All that information he'd taken from Maul had taught him a thing or two when it came to lightsaber forms. His current predatory crouch resembled the Ataru form Qui-Gon himself tended to favor, albeit with 2 blades and a great lack of restraint. "Hey, no fair," he chastised, but his words were lacking in rancor. "I wasn't ready." The Jedi paused at this sudden and unexpected form. He was, however, completely confident in his ability to subdue both blades. Given his skills and years of experience, it was an assurance not misplaced. But he had in all probability never faced someone like Naruto before. While he might be recalcitrant to use the Force in excess for monumental feats such as yanking a starship out of orbit, nearly destroying an entire mountain from the excess, he was more than capable of limiting it to himself and his surroundings. And when he did, when it flowed through him, he was far more powerful than any Jedi or Sith. "My turn." Naruto locked one saber on and flung it at Dooku as he started forwards, the blazing green blur hurtling toward him at a breakneck pace. The older man batted the saber aside with an errant flick of his wrist, refusing to give the discarded weapon so much as a backwards glance. Their sabers clashed then, sapphire against azure, young versus old. They strove against one another, neither willing to use their true strength, each seeking to dominate the other through limited means alone. A duelist should never relinquish control of his lightsaber, Dooku admonished, forcing the blonde's blade closer and closer to the floor. "You've relinquished your advantage, young one." Naruto grinned. "Have I?" The dull thrumming of the lightsaber was almost the last thing he heard, its searing tip just grazing the top of his scalp and passing before Dooku could react, having boomeranged around the room. He could have just as easily taken the Jedi's head off. Naruto could have, but that wasn't the purpose of this exercise. Dooku disengaged just as the viridian shaft slapped into the blonde's palm, the burning blade stabbing at his left leg within a blink of the eye. In the same instant that Dooku's blade scored a clean hit to the Naruto's arm, tearing through his sleeve to draw an angry line across the flesh of his right bicep. The hunger withstood the hot sting of his adversary's sword in due course, only driving him to try harder, making his victory all that much sweeter. 1-1. The Shinobi Menace declared smugly. "I'm impressed, Dooku. You might make me work for this yet." It suddenly occurred to him that said lightsaber didn't have a training setting. He was sure that Aila's might, having not yet tinkered with the blade. But Dooku, he'd rather not have to explain how he'd lost his head as HMI would kill him. So ensorcelled was he in such thoughts that he nearly missed it when the Jedi's blade nicked his knee. 2-1. Dooku chastised, his words sweet with satisfaction. "Oh, come on." Ducking beneath a swing powerful enough to decapitate a reek, Naruto leaned forward in a long thrust that sent the tip of his foremost blade through Dooku's pants and a centimeter deep into his thigh. The Jedi Master actually laughed at the unconventional tactic and swatted at him with his blade, the riposte nearly ripping the viridian shaft from his hand. Naruto cut down at him with the opposite blade, swinging with such force that the floor actually splintered beneath their feet from the force of their block. Dooku bristled, his sword arm aching from what should have been a practiced parry. He was forced to disengage when the blonde came for him, pushing his own body backwards with a monumental effort from the force. Naruto did not pursue, graciously allowing his adversary to catch his breath. 2-2. He admitted, rubbing at his still sore arm with a wince. "I admit, you're a better duelist than I'd expected. Unconventional perhaps and a tad unorthodox, but I find myself admiring it nevertheless. Even with the Force, I'm no match for you in a contest of strength. But I wonder, what about your skill with the Force itself? Care to find out, then?" Indeed. The two men darted forward across the small sanctum, this time holding nothing back. Arms pumped, sabers swung, bars of blue and green light colliding, splitting, colliding again. Blurs of black and tan, jarring against one another, vying for dominance, finding none. Naruto wasn't sure quite how long their little spar lasted, but he was certain of one thing. Dooku was by far the best duelist he'd ever fought, relying only upon the sheer power of the Force to guide his movements. What's more, he had the succinct impression Qui-Gon's former teacher was holding back. probing him, testing his unusual style for weaknesses. Well then let's make him work for those weaknesses, then. Naruto changed styles abruptly, abandoning the aggressive yet elegant Ataru for the more simplistic and defensive Sorsu. Hoping to lure Dooku in, he'd glimpsed it once, during a brief battle with Aula Sakura against a band of raiders, and refined it further since then. At the time, the idea of multiple lightsaber forms had fascinated him. He hadn't had much use for them until he'd fought Maul that first time. No one had ever dared to challenge him since then, and neither had he thought or had the chance to attempt such a technique with twin sabers. Until now, the bounty hunter raised his arm an inch or so off balance, a tempting invitation for the Jedi to gain an easy point. He went for it, and the moment that he did, Naruto had him. He entrapped his saber with the other a heartbeat later, and in spite of his own aggression, he found that it was almost too easy to slip into an easy rhythm of defense against his aging opponent. His and Aula's saber weaving an impenetrable barrier between himself and the master. Thus stymied, Dooku found himself kept at arm's length for the next handful of strikes. Naruto was able to hold him at bay with one saber weight for those rare yet crucial moments in which the Jedi overextended himself, and then strike hard and fast with the more aggressive styles to counterattack. Of course, it also helps that you've got yours truly. Well, yes, there was that. Having Kurama around to act as a second pair of eyes increased his concentration immeasurably. It also helped him to phase out Dooku's unsettling taunts. Your technique is impressive for one untaught. Dooku complimented him between parries, a bead of sweat dripping down his brow. It's a shame, really. We could have used someone like you in the order, and be an emotionless bastard. Naruto huffed as he forced the Jedi out of another saber lock, then another and another still. No, thank you. Arrogance does not become you. Rushing forward, Dooku brought his blade down in a singular swipe that would have cut the shinobi in half from crown to crotch had it landed, which it did not. Dodging right this time, Naruto feinted with his blade. His adversary sidestepped left. Naruto whirled, leapt with the Force's aid, and brought both blades down. Flinching, Dooku managed to block the blow, but overflow from the second sword seared a black streak across both his shoulder and neck. For the first time, the Jedi actually let out a small hiss of pain as the blonde leapt away. It was a thin cut, one that would heal within hours under a back-to-patch, but that thought did little to lessen the sting here and now. Free too, Naruto taunted, stepping back to admire his handiwork. Impressive. But how will you deal with this? Dooku reached out with the Force, seeking to unbalance his opponent. But instead of tripping him up as he'd intended, he encountered resistance. Moving Naruto's left foot even the slightest of centimeters was like trying to move a mountain, so thick and dense that not even the mightiest of masters could hope to lift it. Or him. Naruto didn't budge, didn't even bat an eyelash. Instead, he merely arched an eyebrow, slightly amused as Dooku, straining with every fiber of his being, only managed to make his foot twitch ever so slightly. Guess Qui-Gon didn't tell you about that one, Before the Count could answer, Naruto did something with his little finger. Dooku never saw it. All he felt was the Force roaring forwards toward him like a tsunami of invisible force, shredding through his defenses as though they were flimsiplast. This was no mere Force push. He realized this was a tidal wave. He barely even registered it when the shockwave ripped him from his feet and slammed him against the wall. There was simply no transition of movement. One moment he'd been standing opposite the blonde, bracing himself for an assault. The next he was here, sliding down the wall, lightly puzzled. The impact didn't hurt so much as it did sting. The boy had just been flexing himself in the Force. Had there been any real kind of momentum behind those invisible eddas, he wouldn't be standing right now. With this in mind, Dooku stood, realizing his error. Of course, he'd encountered this anomaly before, but never in a person. Naruto was physically dense in the Force, so much so that it explained his incredible strength. His midi-chlorian count was so high as to actually resist the Force itself, able to withstand punishing assaults while creating his own. Magnificent. I see. I've underestimated you. He relinquished the fact as he found his footing, standing with a weary sigh. Shall we put an end to this little spar, then? Sure thing, old man. Naruto leapt up and away. Dooku was right behind him. And then there was only motions. A glimpse of their reflections on the glistening marble walls showed Dooku's lightsaber moving so fast. He appeared to be enveloped in a sphere of blue fire. Naruto likewise was little more than a blur, taking advantage of his twin sabers to block in one instant, only to renew his assault with a dizzying ferocity the next. But Dooku was good. They stood odd at 3-3. The next strike would determine the victor. That would be his win, of course. He would never lose to a Jedi. Never, ever. It was like flicking a switch. Shall we turn up the heat? Then we shall. Naruto went on the attack then, abandoning all pretense of defense. Sorsu fell to the wayside in the blink of an eye, replaced by the Gemso, and then the more imposing Juyo. Dooku's style of Makashi simply couldn't keep up. It was all he could do to keep the strokes from turning into deadly. At last, his robes smoldering like a house afire from more than a dozen minor slashing wounds inflicted by Naruto's blades, Dooku had no choice but to acquiesce to his opponent. He stepped backward, abruptly shutting down his crooked lightsaber, hooking it to his belt. "No more," he said. "I yield." Accepted. Breathing hard, his body sheathed in sweat, Naruto turned to sheath his own blades. "Not bad. You actually made me try for a bit back there." Hunter and Jedi stared at each other for a long moment, their gazes unwavering before the former finally extended a hand. This was something he'd seldom done. Ayla and Qui-Gon were the only Jedi he deemed worthy of such a gesture. But perhaps Dooku was as well. He had pushed the blonde to his limitius with the Force alone, allowed his skills to improve another notch. He stood outlined against the setting sun, and heaved a heartfelt sigh. "Nice meeting you, Dooku. And you, Menace." The Jedi accepted the offered hand and shook, his grip firm. Despite himself, Naruto almost blanched at the image that popped into his head. This almost reminds me of Lee and Guy's sunset genjutsu." Naruto strode back into his ship, determined to get a good night's sleep. It was a determination he set in his mind the moment he departed the Temple of Theed, utilizing Hurration to arrive at the still open ramp of his vessel, dispelling his clones and shutting it firmly behind him. He murmured a greeting to HK-47 as well as Sparky, pausing only to check on Anakin in his separate quarters before making for his own. Amusingly, Annie had fallen asleep with Vet and Set. The twin Twi'leks were curled around him such a way as to suggest they'd either been reading him a bedtime story, or they'd simply chosen to rest in his bed for the night. Neither option was anything but hilarious, so he snapped a picture with his holocam and let the boy be, resolving to tease his progeny incessantly at a later date. With that settled and his ship successfully locked down, Uzumaki Naruto flung open the hatch to his own quarters, determined to do the same with his body, fling it onto the bed, and at which point, determination vanished like a solar sail in a sun flare. SHMI had surprised him of late with her marked change in attitude, but what she was wearing when she greeted him seemed to be shocking even for her. A shimmering silver drapery, as much cloud as cloth, it clung to her body while remaining in constant and revealing motion. It was as if she had slipped into a pearlescent mist that coated the shore of a moonlight beach. It flowed in all directions, maintaining the shape of her body while giving fleeting, suggestive glimpses of it. The necklace and bracelet complete the ensemble, but somehow his attention wasn't focused there. She was on his bed, waiting for him. Oh dear, Kami, have mercy on this poor perverted soul of his. "Welcome home, darling." She smiled for him, her words husky. "I've got good news and bad news. Which would you like to hear first?" "Good. You're going to be the fater of twins." T-twins. It was all Naruto could do to stop his jaw dropping straight to the floor. "Well, shit." He composed himself quickly, seeing the fire in her eyes. "And the bad?" SHMI's smile drew another inch. "You're not going to get any sleep tonight." "How is that, Ga?" His words ended in a strangled grunt as she tackled him, driving her lips against his. That night, he forgot all about his troubles. There was a grand parade the following day to publicly recognize the newfound alliance of the Naboo and Gungan peoples, to celebrate their hard-fought victory over the Trade Federation invaders, and in honor to those who had fought to secure the planet's freedom. And to Naruto's embarrassment, and at Padme's personal behest, he had to be a part of the damned thing. Well, at least that damn Gungan Jar Jar was dead. A spry smile leapt to his face at the thought, even as he struggled to control his mount. The last thing he would have wanted was for the Gungan to muck up a celebration like this. Crowds lined the streets of Theed as columns of Gungan warriors astride Kadu, and Naboo soldiers aboard speeders rode through the city to the sounds of cheering and singing. Famball lumbered down the avenues, draped in rich silks and embroidered harnesses, heads weaving from side to side on long necks. Here and there, a Capture Federation tank hovered amidst the marchers, Naboo and Gungan flags flying from cannons and hatchways, children hanging on their curved edges. Naruto and SHMI and Anakin, father and mother and son, rode a single Kadu at the head of it all, the first responsible for slaying a Sith, the second responsible for marshalling the Gungan army to victory, and last but certainly not least, the third was the destroyer of the droid control ship. The Shinobi turned bounty hunter wore piecemeal bits of his armor, his face exposed for all to see, his whiskered cheeks turned up in a smile that wasn't entirely forced as the adoring masses chanted their names. Shmi seemed to take it all in stride. The smile never once left her face. Anakin blushed and managed the occasional wave or two, but continued to try and steal the occasional glance at his parents, unable to believe that he, their son, was a part of this. Anakinskywalker could barely believe it himself. He'd blown up the droid control ship. At his father's command, he'd started up the Konoha, already knowing its inner workings inside and out, and quite simply gone to war. The vessel's shields had been no match for the warship's superior weaponry alongside Vet and Set's marksmanship. But enough of that. He looked now toward their final destination. Padme. She caught his gaze and smiled brightly at him, causing the boy to flush even further. Captain Panaka, alongside the Queen's own guards, stood at the top of the stone steps in the plaza, watching the parade approach. His uniform was creased, metal insignia on his epaulets gleaming, proud and strong. A finer sight had never been seen in his eyes. Obiwankenobi stood with his former master near the Queen, struggling to suppress his emotions. He was feeling out of place and embarrassed by the revelry. Perhaps it was his new robes, or the lack thereof, the lock of hair signifying him as a learner no longer present by his ear. Make no mistake, he thought the parade wonderful, and he appreciated being honored with the others, but his mind was elsewhere. It was with the hunter in the parade. It was with his master, no longer his teacher, but his brother in arms. It was with the Sith, and the emerging threat that they now posed to the galaxy. He wore the clothing of a Jedi Knight, and he'd never felt more undeserving of the role. Having fallen in the battle against the Sith, did he truly deserve his newfound rank? If it hadn't been for Naruto and Qui-Gon, he'd almost certainly be dead. If it hadn't been for Ayla, he might have lost his leg. As it were, he owed the three of them a great debt, one he might never truly be able to repay. And yet, for some miraculous reason, in spite of his ineptitude, the council had knighted him anyway. Clearly a mistake on their part. So he smiled, but he was sick in spirit and lost in his heart. Perhaps sensing his discomfort, Qui-Gon reached out to put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's the beginning of a new life for you, my friend," he ventured. His words seemed to solidify the gap between them. No longer were they master and student, but brothers in arms. Comrades. The thought sobered his mind, made his master's next words seem almost airy. "I told you this day would come, didn't I?" "Yes, master." Obi-Wan smiled dutifully but said nothing more. Qui-Gon looked off at the crowds in front of them. "I've always disdained celebrations like this," he murmured, almost to himself. "But I understand the need for them as well. I wonder what Naruto makes of all this." Obi-Wan shrugged. The Jedi smiled. "I think he would be proud, just as I am of you." His former student finally turned, finally looked at him. "You think so, master?" Such titles would fade with time, but for him, Qui-Gon would always be just that. His teacher. "I do," the older Jedi agreed. Obi-Wan's mouth tightened. "I don't feel worthy of that." The Jedi's hand tightened on his shoulder. "You will, one day." "And what of you, master?" Qui-Gon blinked. "What of me?" "Master Dooku told me you'll be leaving the order as well." It was not a question. Dooku was leaving to return to his homeworld of Serrano for reasons unknown, supposedly to reclaim his title and estate as Count. But it was Qui-Gon who had his own reasons for departing, just as he had yet to make any mention of them. "All that. Yes," he admitted. "I feel my place is no longer here. I have done what little good I can in such a limited stead. But now, the Force calls me elsewhere." "With Naruto, you mean?" "Perhaps." Though the old Jedi's smile said he was thinking about it. "I may consider it. But your place is here, my former Padawan." He finally took his hand from the young man's shoulder, but not before relinquishing a small hilt to the youth. His hilt. His lightsaber. "I sense you will do great things in the years to come. I know you won't let me down." Tears stung at the eyes of Obi-Wan. "Master, all will be well, Obi-Wan." Qui-Gon soothed him, their gaze returning to the parade once more. "The Force has shown me the way." The parade wound through the central plaza to where the Queen and her guests view the procession. She stood with her handmaidens, Governor Co. Bibble, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, Boss Nass of the Gungans, and 12 members of the Jedi Council, including Dooku himself. R2-D2 and Sparky occupied a space just below the handmaidens and next to Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon. Domed heads swiveling from side to side as they chattered away at one another in droid speak. Lights blinking, sensors taking everything in, studiously avoiding the eerily bright photoreceptors of HK-47 just between them. So many meatbags, and not a single one to shoot. The droid lamented sadly. "Oh, woe is me." R2-D2 beeped at the bot and Sparky seconded, to which the hunter shot them a scathing glare. "No, I am not content killing droids. Be quiet before I decide to make an exception for the two of you." that shattered the ice. Obi-Wan actually laughed at the droid's remark, earning a slight smile from his master. Truly, the Shinobi Menace surrounded himself with all manner of misfits hailing from all walks of life. A pair Twi'lek twins rescued from lives of slavery, an astromech droid with erratic behavior protocols, a hunter-killer unit with a sense of humor, a wife who could shoot as well as she could cook, a son with exceptional piloting skills, and now potentially a former Jedi Master. All he needed was a Wookiee. Boss Nass stepped forward and held the globe of peace high over his head, interrupting further musings. "Peace," he declared above the cheering and clapping. Below the steps, Naruto laughed and shook himself merrily. It was good to have peace again, however tenuous it might be. For the people to have hope again, something to believe in again. On the broad avenue below, in a long, colorful ribbon of life, the parade that had carried them to this place and time continued on. And so too, did time itself. Shinra Tensei, Anakinskywalker gasped as the very atmosphere boiled against his body, wave after wave of invisible pressure washing over him, the very air itself trying to hurl him to his doom. He resisted, but only barely, his long legs driving an angry red furrow into the earth. A stray strand of still darkening hair peeked down into his vision and forced a blink. Without thinking, he swatted it aside to peer at his opponent. That tiny lapse, that brief moment of inattention cost him most dear. Even as he lowered his hand, he felt the pushing forces subside, replaced by a sharp pull. Bansho Tenon. The world lurched around him, and this time he was powerless to resist. His body flew forward, his dark tunic ruffling wildly as the distance shrank between them. He barely parried the opening thrust, blue striking against blue, their lightsabers colliding violently before he managed to wrench himself away. His father stood opposite him, those eerie-rimmed eyes peering back at him without fear or any emotion for that matter. That was always something Anakin had envied about Naruto. The man lived his life without even the most minor regrets, taking nothing for granted. It was also something he secretly loathed. How could he live like this and not regret it? Why was he so damned confident? His mind recoiled at the thought, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to draw upon the power of the Force, and coincidentally his anger, to aid him. Don't even think about it. The man's voice was harsh and cold, like the wastelands of Hoth, or someone will die. Something in Anakin quailed at the sound of those words, shrinking away as his father stared him down. What had Naruto called it? Killer intent. His parent wielded it to devastating effect. Even without his blasters, he could literally stare a foe into submission. It was worse when he spoke. His cold battle voice could make a rancor weep. The ice in his stare would have been enough to force the fight out of a lesser man. Thankfully, Anakin knew how to resist it. He seized upon the image of Padme in his mind. They collided once more in a whirlwind of blows, young against old, peace versus anger. Naruto was like ice and Anakin fire. Polar opposites, cold and hot, a reflection of their FGHting styles. Naruto's attacks were frigidly dispassionate. If you gave him even the slightest opening, he would exploit it. Anakin's confidence was fierce, embodied by his aggressive style, abandoning the precise form of Sorsu for the aggressive and higher form of combat, his youthful stamina serving him well against his opponent. Naruto might be a fine warrior, but he was getting old. Using the Rinnegan twice in one day tired him almost imperceptibly, but it was still there, a slight slackening of his stride, a weakening of his swing. And then it happened. Saber spitting sparks, his father leapt away. "It's over, Anakin," he called down at him, his voice peaking with exhaustion. "I have the high ground." The younger Skywalker scoffed at his progenitor, dark eyes blazing with surprise, then arrogance. It was true. His father had the advantage of terrain now. Any assault on his part was doomed to fail against him. A wise opponent would have admitted his defeat, surrendered. But something held the young man back. What was it? Pride? Determination? Overconfidence? He wasn't sure what, only that a low growl left his lips. "You underestimate my power, father, and you overestimate my tolerance, son." The reply was as immediate as it was scathing, his face twisting in unseen recognition. "Back down. It's over." They stood there for a long moment, father and son. What felt like an eternity passed between them. Finally Anakin raised his blade, the blue-white bar of light humming as he started forward. Naruto frowned, realizing just what his progeny intended to do, and he didn't like it one bit. Even without the Rinnegan, he could see the chakra flowing through his legs. "Oh dear, don't try it. Too late." Steeling himself for the strain, the younger of the pair made the jump, vaulting forward and into the air. It was a mistake. Too late he realized his father was all too prepared to strike with the blade. Its deadly sapphire glow seemed to swell before his vision as it moved to intercept trajectory, the heat of its edge burning, promising pain as it descended upon his flesh. Oh Lord, this was going to hurt. VZZM. Anakin yelped in surprise, then pain as his leap arc was bisected by the blue blade, its eerie radiance swatting his own aside and striking unerringly at his head. But there was no blood, no lopping of limbs, no severing of heads, just pain. Hissing out an obscenity, he tumbled past Naruto, clutching feebly his head and the rising welt within. Naruto swatted at him a second time as he tumbled away and down the hill, producing yet another but by no means less painful dent upon the boy's unprotected posterior. Poof. Naruto blinked in surprise, a smile leaping to his lips when his son popped out of existence into a harmless plume of smoke, his body replaced by an inert log. Substitution A. He ignited his second saber and lowered it to the south, the verdant blade effortlessly blocking the strike that seemed to come from out of nowhere. It was pointless to attack him directly, what with his Beskar armor, but he gave the boy points for trying. A swift swing of the blade and he batted him aside, swatting him back with ease. Good, good. He rewarded his son's stealthy strike. Don't think like a Jedi. Think like a Shinobi. Follow through. Don't give your enemy the chance to recover. Like this, he was upon the boy almost before he realized it, raining blows down against him with a wildness that was as aggressive as it was impossible to predict. 1. His bones ached. 2. His body quaked. 3. Anakin tried to parry the third strike but to no avail. His father's strength was too much. He swatted his saber aside as though it were a wooden sword, a knee crushing against the boy's stomach. That was that. Damn, but the old man was a brutal teacher. Too slow. The boy didn't have the breath to offer a retort as he rolled down the hill, every fiber of his being screaming for air that refused to come. The grassy plains of Naboo tickled his nose, tormenting, offering no solace to his sorry state currently crouched at the bottom of the grassy overlook. That hurt, damn it. Pain is an excellent teacher, Naruto replied, extinguishing the blade. Yeah, well, so is kindness. His father lowered the training saber and promptly burst into hysterics, chest heaving heavily as he struggled to try and contain his mirth. Anakin didn't find it all that funny. He was tired of being beaten to the ground by his old man. When Naruto had offered to teach him the art of the blade, he had jumped at the chance, eager to test his newly created lightsaber. Their stay on Naboo was something of a short one. Everyone had taken a welcome chance to recover from their wounds, and now, that month-long respite was nearly over. During that time, his father had been quite busy taking care of Shmi. The blonde that stood before him at present was a clone and nothing more, but a very vindictive one at that. Yesterday had been blaster training with Vet and Set. Today, his least favorite of days, was lightsaber combat. He'd advanced rapidly in the last month, with Qui-Gon and Naruto to guide him. He even constructed a lightsaber of his own, though his father had been adamant that it remain in training mode lest he lose a limb. It had been a wise decision. Though he stood soaked with sweat, skin glistening in the early light of morning radiance, he still felt as though he had accomplished something in surprising his father. Why can't Qui-Gon teach me? Qui-Gon would hold back on a beginner, Naruto admonished, still chuckling. Besides, he's busy looking at the starship. 4, on the other hand, have plenty of time and won't hold back in the slightest. Welcome to the crash course of life, kid. You'll thank me for this someday. His eyes flashed dangerously. Or would you rather I let Kurama take over your training? Anakin blanched at the mention of the kitsune that was his father's darker half. No thank you. Great. Shall we continue, then? Already. Naruto burst into hysterics again, his loud laughter rippling over the plains with the rising sun. Shmi found herself suddenly beset by the urge to smile as Naruto helped ease her into a chair, hovering around her like the protective husband that he truly was. Her pregnancy was progressing rapidly. What had barely been noticeable only a month before now felt like it was at least nearly 3 months along now. Perhaps it had something to do with his unique DNA or even Kurama's chakra. Whatever the case, she'd begun to feel like something a bloated whale trapped her in the Konoha. And she wasn't even at 9 months yet. If this kept up, then the twins. Echoing her thoughts, a gentle nudge pushed at her stomach, immediately followed by another. Something wrong. They're moving. She smiled softly, touching a tender hand to her stomach. Naruto's expression was wondrous. He laid an ear against the protruding bulge, only to start back in surprise moments later, eyes wide with delighted joy. They'd kicked. So enraptured was he at the two. Have you finally convinced her to stay? By what? Naruto sputtered his surprise. No, I sent a clone to calm her down before she left. She'll be staying, then. What makes you say that? Shmi's smile was only slightly mysterious. Because I know you, was all she would say. And I've already told you, I don't mind. Yeah, about that. You want me to do what? Embarrassment crept up the back of Oila's neck, turning her cheeks a palpable shade of violet. The Twi'lek wasn't entirely certain she'd heard him right. They hadn't spoken since he'd visited her in the infirmary only a few weeks ago, but it felt like a gulf had grown between them since then. In that time, her efforts had been focused strictly on healing and recreating another lightsaber, her old one lent to Naruto. Imagine her surprise then when the blonde sought her out today, the very day she was to return to Coruscant. Her bag was packed, her meager possessions stored in her satchel. The shuttle was waiting. The last thing she'd expected was for him to confront her in the hangar. "I want you to hit me," he replied levelly, his facial expression still set in stone. "Once, twice, hell, 3 times if it makes you feel better." If this was one of his oft-distributed clones, she couldn't tell. Even with the Force, it was impossible to distinguish one from the other. That was an admirable talent given his chosen field. To be able to replicate oneself was a talent that anyone would want. Even a Jedi. "I'm not sure that's wise. Did I ask for your opinion here?" The blonde cracked his neck from side to side, blue eyes regarding her coolly. "I said hit me. You're going to do that and we're going to get all this aggression out. Put it behind us." Ayla hesitated, considering. She had volunteered to remain behind on Naboo to ensure no further incursion from the trade federations, but in reality she simply couldn't bring herself to leave, not with things as they stood between them. But her time here was nearly over and she had to return. Soon. Was it right for her to feel this way? For these feelings to tear at her breast? "I can't or won't," Naruto challenged, his words reverberating across the empty bay. Ayla was suddenly intensely thankful that no one was up and about at this ghoulish hour in the morning. It would have been mortifying for someone to overhear them. Still, those syllables struck a chord somewhere deep within her soul. A very vocal part of her admired him, wanted to be with him, and his words had roused that side of herself to actions in spite of her best attempts to suppress it. "Are you trying to make me angry? If it helps us solve this problem, then yes, I'd be moved." The word rushed out of him in a surprised whoosh of air, her fist finding his stomach between the armored plating. It was like being tackled by a rancor. For a slim little thing, Ayla Secura hit hard. Very hard. Had he been a shadow clone, she realized, he would have dispelled by now. She knew for a fact that the blonde's doppelgangers, while numerous, could only take so much damage before disappearing. Oddly enough, she felt some of her anger dissipate as she unsheathed her elbow from his stomach. Hell, she half expected him to lash out at her in recompense. Instead, he simply straightened, albeit with a grimace. "Feeling any better?" he asked with a slight wheeze. Rare, red anger colored her vision. How dare he? Ayla hit him again. This time, her knuckles crunched against his nose, snapping his head back from the blow. Naruto just laughed. She watched, awestruck as the cartilage simply snapped back into place, the blonde's ridiculous regeneration mending the injury at a speed that'd make even back to balk. "How about now? By the Force, you are insufferable," says the emotionless Jedi. Naruto returned with a hiss, touching his newly healed nose. "I'm doing this for your sake, you know. I may have told you to hit me as many times as you saw fit, but it's obvious this isn't going anywhere fast." Sighing, he reached toward his belt, unclipping his sabers. It loathed her to admit it, but on some inherent level he was right. A Jedi shouldn't feel this way, she shouldn't feel this way, and yet she did. Her teachings demanded that she reject this attachment, but her heart had other plans, refusing to relinquish its hold on the blonde so lightly. It was this same conflict that was slowly tearing Ayla Secura apart. She should either toe the line or abandon it altogether. The same could also be said of Naruto. Did he truly care about her, or was he content to keep her at arm's length? Were his soft words those of a companion, or something more? There could be no middle ground for either of them, not here. "Gao," he said slowly, "we spar." There was no pause, no warning. One moment the Shinobi Menace stood across from her, the next he roared forward, filling her vision, the sudden displacement of mass sending her soaring from her feet. Ayla barely has a moment to ignite her own newly made blade before he fell upon her in a cyclone of spinning blades. Then there was only the Force. Naruto's combat style is different than what she's accustomed to. He's all jagged edges and precision, aggression tempered only by an icy resolve. He attacks and attacks and attacks again, as though victory is the one and only thing he can think about. Nothing else matters. It's not dark, she thinks, but neither is it light. The closest thing she can claim for it to be is gray. Power teems under his skin, but he doesn't use it. Not all of it is unleashed in that instant. So much is still held back. Even then, a mere quarter of his strength is enough to send her skittering backwards in retreat. His blades fill the air with their deadly thrum, descending flawlessly for her head, leaving time for only one thought as she fends him off. Parry, what? Block, is, parry, this. Inadvertently responding to her distress, the force peeked outward from her in a rising wave, blasting the blonde halfway across the hangar. There was a sickening crunch of metal as he slammed into one of the Nubian starfighters, caroming painfully off the durasteel hull despite his Beskar plating. There was a silence as he lay there dazed and unmoving, the vessel hanging precariously over his head. A twinge of warning from within the force was his only warning before she angrily grabbed the wounded vessel with telekinesis and yanked it down on his head, crushing him beneath. There was a silence as she realized what she had done, her anger having gotten the better of her perhaps the first and last time. Tears brimmed in her eyes, regret for what she'd just done. And then, Naruto. As if summoned by the sound of her voice, his sabers flashed beneath the vessel's great bulk, one blue, the other green. Ayla yelped as they carved through the Nubian like butter. Its severed halves skittered across the hangar in either direction, leaving her thunderstruck. That, he began hoarsely, wiping a thin line of blood away from his mouth, is quite enough. There's a moment of silence as he stands across from her, and in that instant Ayla sees him as he truly is. He is energy. His body is the force personified and made flesh, millions of midichlorians working together in a violent concerto that promises peace for the downtrodden, but no mercy for his enemies. Neither light nor dark, just gray. Naruto, she began weakly as he approached. I didn't mean to do that, it was a mistake. I'm sorry. Still he stalked forward, his eyes never leaving hers. Ayla shrank in on herself. She wanted to curl up somewhere in a dark corner and weep. Just weep. Her frustration had gotten the better of her once more and now she was about to pay the price for it. But she wouldn't go down without getting everything out. It's just, I care for you, about you, everything. I've cared this whole time and you won't even give me an answer and Ayla. She froze as a battered hand reached up to cup her cheek. Why yes, stop talking. His lips took hers then and she melted, knees buckling. It was a gentle touch of the lips, nothing more, but it sent tongues of fire shooting through her cheeks and dancing down her leku. Her mind was little more than one crazy blur, her thoughts slamming against one another, colliding violently. Who what? If you meatbags are done sucking face, the monotone voice of HK-47 interrupted. I have a matter that bears importance. Qui-Gon requests your help with your latest acquisition. Sparky trilled impatiently beside him. Relax, killer. Naruto sighed, disentangling himself from Ayla. I was just saying goodbye. I do not like that name. The droid somehow managed to deadpan despite its emotionless face. I know. Actually, Naruto blinked. I'm not leaving. Her words were small and soft, but there they were. Would you be willing to let me stay? Another blink. It'd be my pleasure. Trust me, she said, a sultry tone rising over her cheer. The pleasure is all mine. She turned and walked away, swaying her hips with each step, and as she rounded a corner farther down the corridor, he could hear her quietly laughing. Naruto shook his head as he watched her go. What the hell had he gotten himself into here? Had his desires finally gotten the better of him? SHMI had made it abundantly clear many times that she didn't mind sharing him. So what was this feeling of dread? Perhaps, had he been more focused, he might have seen Anakin's shadow clone peering at him from around the corner. A few hangars down, one of Naruto's clones quietly shivered at the feedback. Naruto warily input the code for Maul's Sith infiltrator, peering intently at the keypad as the ramp hissed open, settling before him with an audible click. 4 entire weeks had passed since their gala celebrating Naboo's freedom from the oppression of the Trade Federation, and still the festivities showed no sign of stopping. Outside the hangar, the sounds of merriment could still be heard. But that wasn't why he was here, him and Qui-Gon, in the dead of night, messing with a Sith ship. Their purpose was far less sinister than one might think. Almost benign, even. They were here to steal it. Officially, the Jedi Council have laid claim to the deadly vessel after purging it off all taints of the dark side. Unofficially, Obi-Wan-Kenobi, the Jedi assigned to reclaim said ship, had never done so. Qui-Gon knew not the thoughts of his former Padawan, now light years distant, but he suspected his one-time protege had chosen to leave the vessel in their care rather than take it for himself. For this, Qui-Gon was most grateful. Although he found the Konoha most welcome to his presence, he felt he needed to have a vessel of his own. Probably why the boy had accidentally left them the key code. Are you certain about this? He asked. Hey, you're not a Jedi anymore, right? Naruto turned his gaze away from the gaping maw that led into Maul's former home, bringing himself face to face. You can have it if you want. His gaze snapped back towards the vessel honestly. This thing gives me the creeps. The older man sighed, his large shoulders sagging in defeat. Very well. I see there's to be no talking you out of this. Naruto's grin was positively beatific. I love it when you see. But now to the matter at hand. He'd chosen to inspect the ship before bringing it to Mandalore. Now he was beginning to wonder just what manner of secrets might be hidden away within the cockpit. It creaked open as he input the second code, quietly bracing himself as its second door whooshed open. Phew, what he found there caused his eyes to bulge. A sharp, feminine gasp came from within the ship. Baleful yellow eyes, Sith eyes glared back at them. Die in the name of Lord Maul. What in the? That was all he managed before a crimson lightsaber guided. Then an explosion of force lightning ripped through the ship and slammed into his chest. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine was uneasy. The faint light afforded by the cityscape of Coruscant's evening coupled with the glow rods placed in his own office shone dimly through the transparent steel viewport at his back. Shadows stretched and twined wildly in his peripherals, only serving to put him even more ill at ease. The hour was late and he was nearly ready to leave for the evening. Yet something kept him here tonight. For the last 3 days the Force had been in a state of constant flux. He'd been unable to see anything. That in and of itself was disquieting. He expected those foul Jedi to be impaired in that realm of course, but not a being of his caliber. Nearly a month had passed since Uzumaki Naruto had left Naboo, since any and all tabs placed on him and his ragtag little band had gone dark. He should have been able to sense someone among Fel, be it his wife, those Twi'leks, the former Jedi Qui-Gon Jinn or Isla Secura, or even that blighted Skywalker boy. But he felt nothing. None of them. It was as if they'd simply ceased to exist altogether. If they'd died in a horrific accident or some such, he would have at least sensed something. As if that weren't enough, he was almost certain that Lord Maul's craft and all the secrets it contained had been appropriated by the little wretch. Rumor had it he'd gone back to those who had first trained him. That he was hunting the Mask of Mandalore for unbeknownst reason. Some said that he'd lost his wife and gone out to the far rim to mourn her passing. Still others insisted he was still on Naboo somehow secretly acting as the Queen's bodyguard. But rumors were just that. Rumors. Everything he had worked for, everything he would ever be, hinged on knowing where that man was at all times. And if he knew where he was then he could make certain that man died. It wasn't easy work surprising someone who could hide himself from the Force, but he was certain that he'd worked out a way to do it. His family. If the man had any weakness, it was as simple as striking at those he cared about. Taking one or more of them captive would ensure either his loyalty, or better yet, lure him to a place where he could be slain. But now the elusive hunter was nowhere to be found, and it was absolutely infuriating. A chime sounded, dragging him out of the seething pit of his thoughts. Belatedly the Sith Lord blinked, driving those dark thoughts away from his mind, if only for the moment. He couldn't risk being discovered. Not yet, not when he was nearing the next phase of his plan. Someone to see you, sir. Carefully composing his face into a mask of serene calm, he steepled his fingers together and laid his chin to rest upon them. Send them in. The doors slid open almost before he'd finished speaking. Uzumaki Naruto walked through them. He was completely unprepared for the presence of the Mandalorian. That soulless, T-shaped visor seemed to peer into his very soul. The dark, ebon armor appeared to drink in all light and make the room appear more a void than a sunlight office. He was Palpatine, noted with a slight discomfort armed to the teeth. Crushgaunts covered his arms to the elbows, a pair of blasters nestled smoothly in their holsters. And there, dangling at his belt, the lightsabers. A snake of doubt coiled in his gut. Why was he armed? He shouldn't be allowed to carry all those weapons here, into his presence. As ever, he couldn't sense anything about the man. There was no lingering aura of danger about him, nothing to suggest what his next move might be. He just stood there, staring. A trickle of sweat ran down the Sith's neck. Something was wrong. Why did he have so many weapons? Menace. It was an effort to keep his voice tight, controlled. To what do I owe the pleasure? Save the pleasantries, Chancellor. The man's voice sounded like a controlled avalanche through the filter of his helmet. I am here on business, not pleasure. Sidious swallowed once, hoping that his own anxiety did not reflect in his eyes. Maybe it did. Maybe it didn't. In the end, he realized that the shinobi turned hunter wasn't going to walk away. He was here for something. Please, he gestured to a nearby chair. Sit. Naruto remained standing, a silent sentinel in the night. Finally, he spoke. What do you know about the Sith? He asked. Palpatine feigned a scoff. Why, as much as any man, I suppose. They've been extinct for ages. He allowed a false note of fear to creep into his voice. Are you suggesting that the assassin on Naboo was? Deny. There was no proof. He'd been meticulous, fastidious. That last ounce of proof had died worth Maul. I dare say the Jedi would know more about this than me. The man said nothing, so he continued the charade. Surely you don't think that there might be another Sith lurking out there? Perhaps. That faceless helm inclined a fraction of an inch. I recently came across a young woman who knew a great deal about them. Oh dear, he didn't like where this was going. Not at all. She sounds like a talented individual. She is, came the reply. Her name is Celeste Morn. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the name. No one you'd know. The man dismissed his inquiry with a wave of the hand. She was stark raving mad when we found her in that ship, completely subservient to man who'd somehow managed to release her. When we opened the hatch that day, she attacked us both and we were forced to subdue her. He began to pace, moving around the room in slow, practiced strides. Fascinating thing, that necklace she was wearing. Did you know, Chancellor, the item in question was a Sith artifact. Positively ancient. It ended up warping her mind. Palpatine followed him closely with his eyes, watching warily as he continued to round the table. A knot of dread began to worm its way to his stomach, then his chest, until finally it found its way to his throat. Maul had an apprentice. This complicated things, but she couldn't have known. It wasn't possible. Not possible. Why are you bringing this to me? All in good time, my dear Chancellor. A crushgun settled on his shoulder briefly, the chill of death before moving away. But back to the girl. Again, mad as a hatter, that one. Swore she'd never talk. But eventually, as most beings do, she saw it my way. All I had to do was break the necklace. Then she told me the most fascinating things she'd heard, seen, not just about him, but his master as well. A Sith Lord. He was bluffing. He had to be. He couldn't possibly know. Stay calm. I take it you have some proof as to the identity of this Sith Lord. Nothing substantial, Naruto answered, his voice cutting through to the bone. I've spent the last 3 days narrowing down the suspects. Just this morning I informed the Jedi Council. They're still deliberating, so I thought I'd bring the matter to your attention. See what you knew. Sidious felt the ghost of a smile threaten to form on his face and ruthlessly squashed it. So the man knew nothing, after all. He was grasping in the dark, hoping to find that which wasn't there. Well, I regret to inform you that I know as much as you do, likely much less. I suspected as much. A tense moment of silence passed between the two men, the bounty hunter towering over him, the Chancellor at his desk. Once more, Palpatine wished the Mandalorian wasn't so damn dense in the Force, his every action shrouded in secrecy. Was he simply masking his emotions? Or had the dreaded killer of men somehow learned to hide himself from even the Force itself? He wasn't sure which bothered him more. The idea that he'd discovered his identity and was simply mocking him was absolutely galling. I wish you luck in your investigation, then. Thank you. A nod just like that, the killer turned to leave. Oh, he paused before the door. One more thing. Have a pleasant evening. Darth Sidious. Palpatine froze. I'm terribly sorry. Who is that? The Shinobi Menace didn't ask or answer any more questions, and there was no warning for what came next. He simply raised a blaster and fired. Completely flat-footed, the bolt caught Palpatine in the shoulder, sending him spinning out of the chair and sprawling to the floor. Pain shot up his arm, empowering him with anger and fury. Another shot snapped at him where he lay in the carpet, one he was forced to roll aside from with an expedient of the Force. Snarling, he felt his eyes flash a sickly yellow. He knew. Somehow, someway, the blasted man knew. No, it was too soon. Guards, he cried. Guards, come quickly. There's a madman in my office. Don't bother, came the rumbling reply from behind the mask. I'm jamming all electronics in your office as we speak. Your receptionist is sound asleep at my suggestion, as did your guards, hours away. You won't be able to call for help. Now get up, would you kindly? A booted foot nudged him in the side. Fight like a man. Die like one. If you wish. Rage knotted the older man's features. He couldn't die here. No, he reasoned. His plans were still blaster-proof. There was still a way out of this. A way to see the end game of his goal. And all that stood in the way of them was one man. No, you. A mortal man. You will die. The hunter's head twisted aside as the old man lashed out. The Force pushed, displacing empty air as it flowed past, shattering the viewport. His helmet cocked aside, quizzically. Is that it, old man? I'm disappointed. Then the crackle of Force lightning filled the air. Naruto ignited his lightsaber and tried to bring it round in time, but his reflexes were a hair too slow. The fork took him dead center in the chest and every muscle in his body clamped down. Too late he realized his mistake. Only a master of the Force could truly hurt him, and Darth Sidious was just that. A master. This lightning made Mauls feel a mere tingle by comparison. It was a force to be reckoned with. Every cell in his body and each fiber of his being was suddenly racked by undeniable agony. His body smoldering, he dropped to a knee. Poor little hunter. Above him, Sidious crowed, cackling in what he believed to be triumph, drinking in his victory. You were a fool to come alone. His prey raised its gaze, gasping softly. I'm never alone. Sidious frowned and jolted him again, his attention fixed firmly on the body writhing beneath him. The Force screamed a warning. Too late. An azure streak flashed in the night, followed by the scent of cauterized flesh, the dread thrumming of a lightsaber carving. Then there was only pain. Sidious gawped down at his left hand. Well, what little was left of it. 3 of his 5 fingers had been severed well below the knuckles, leaving him only with his thumb and pinky. In the next instant he roared, turning the fury of his discharge upon the one who dared to strike him from behind. But instead of meeting flesh, the deadly arc found itself deflected and absorbed by a blade. The jagged fork bisected before it struck the one responsible, and flung the Twi'lek from his office, and back in Tati reception hall. Isla Secura, the menace cried out, stubbornly ignored the pain and pushed, then felt the force lightning slide away as his attacker staggered back. He leapt up, or rather tried to leap up, and managed to regain his feet. His body was still stiff, stubborn, and protesting against the sudden movement so soon. Then vision cleared. He could see Sidious 20 paces away, running for the safety of the doors. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The man was fleeing. Naruto growled, "No, no, no, don't you dare scurry away." Reaching out for the doors, he yanked them shut in the man's face. It would have been very satisfying to see him run headlong into the durasteel, but he somehow managed to right himself at the last second and spin away before he barreled into the durasteel. A silver cylinder was suddenly in his hand, emerging from some hidden compartment in his desk to fly into his palm. With an electric snap hiss, the lightsaber flared to life, the burning red brand shining like an angry torch of hatred in the dim lightning. Yellow eyes glistened furiously. "You have no idea of the enemy you've just made. I've made worse than you." Stumbling slightly, the Mandalorian found his footing. He stood woodenly, without care. A hand jerked up, ripping his helmet free, exposing the blistering scars within. "But you made it personal. I've seen what you are and what you'll do to my boy. And I can't have that. You will not stop me." The Sith hissed, baring his teeth in defiance. "That child will become more powerful than either of us." "No, he won't." The Shinobi menace simply raised his blade and snapped off a sloppy salute. Sidious flew at him with a roar. The armor he wore was problematic at best, but he remained confident that he could find a way through and strike in the weak points. Everything has a weakness, a vulnerability, just waiting to be exploited. And he was a master at the art of exploitation. He saw the blaster bolt coming almost before the man even fired with his free hand, and batted it harmlessly away into the ceiling. Then, before he could further draw upon his arsenal, he hit. They collided in a vortex of snarls and sabers. Red beats against blue in a wild flurry, the deadly crackle of their swords filling the office with sparks. The menace is stronger than he looks. Much stronger. Nothing is held back here. His mighty strength is enough to send him skittering backwards in retreat. Their blades fill the air with their deadly thrum, descending flawlessly for each other's head, leaving no time for thought. Only primal anger and hatred as they fended one another off. Naruto's combat style was very much like that of a Sith, all jagged edges and offenses, aggression tempered only by an burning resolve. He attacked and attacked and attacked again, as though victory was the one and only thing he's able to think about. Nothing else matters. It's not quite dark, but neither is it light. He thought he caught a glimpse of red beneath that visor, likely his imagination. The boy was no duelist, but the sheer ferocity of his offense, coupled by his youthful vigor, Beskar armor, and unpredictable style made for a formidable opponent. Then came the unexpected. Instead of meeting his blade with his own once more, the hunter uttered only 2 words. A wall of power met him, stopping his assault cold. 2 words, a simple set of syllables, and yet they ruined everything. Shinra Tensei. Darth Sidious felt the air rush out of his lungs and boil around him as a giant, invisible hand clamped down on his body and violently tossed him out the window. It wasn't the force he could have at least countered, that of this was much he was certain. It was something else altogether, and he was utterly powerless against it. The lightsaber clattered out of his grasp and tumbled away to the ground leagues below, forsaking him as he scrabbled for a handhold. His left arm, the injured arm, failed him almost immediately. The fingers of his right hand were all that remained, all that held him up above the abyss. His eyes shot down, suddenly aware of the lack of traffic in the area. Even at this hour Coruscant was usually bustling with them. But now there was nothing, not a single skycar by which he might cushion his fall. If he fell now, without his lightsaber, weakened as he was, not like this, and suddenly the menace was there, towering over him. His saber slashed down at the ledge, narrowly missing Sidious' hand as he jerked away. How the tables have turned. He sounded disappointed somehow, as though this were all one gigantic farce to him. His voice was little more than a reptilian hiss, utterly unfeeling. "It's funny, really. I've been recording our little scuffle for the last 5 minutes. Before you fried me, I broadcast it across the entire planet. Everyone knows who you are now. Another slash. Another near miss. Soon the entire galaxy will see you for what you've been all this Tim. Proof will vindicate my actions here today and damn you. And you will never slash touch slash my slash boy. His blade paused, hovering just over the man's hand. Sidious stared up into those rippling violet eyes and saw hate. Nothing but anger. In this instant, the man was a maelstrom of hate and passion, fixated on ending the threat that he posed to his family. There was only the hate. He could feel the wind lashing at his face, and he smiled. You think you've won? He hissed, delighting in the man's murderous expression. But you haven't. You've lost. Naruto stared down at the Sith Lord, and his boot crushed down on Sidious's hand. Fall. And the Sith Lord did just that. Ayla groaned. Every fiber of her being ached. Every cell was united in its agony. Her mind swam in a sorcerous sea of light, sounds, and nothing else. How had this happened? Why had it happened? She thought back to their events of only 3 days before, when Naruto and Qui-Gon had come aboard with that raving madwoman in tow, that had caused a stir. They'd interrogated her for days, gotten that foul necklace off her. Then she'd sung like a what was the human bird? A canary. Yes, a canary. Initially, she hadn't believed his words when he'd claimed that the new chancellor was secretly a Sith Lord. Hadn't understood why he knew this, only that he didn't want any of them involved. They'd argued about it for hours, she and him, unable to understand why he had to do this alone. SHMI and the others understood. None had raised a voice in protest. Not even Qui-Gon. It was infuriating. How could they trust him so blindly? She loved him by the Force, and even she was skeptical. What was it about Palpatine that made Naruto so desperate to kill him? She'd seen the haunted look in his eyes, the pain. In the end, she'd chosen to follow him. Everyone else had trusted in his words. She hadn't, so she'd followed. It was easy to stow away on Maul's old infiltrator. The stealth craft bore no shortage of places to hide. If he was making the mistake of a lifetime, then she needed to be there to mitigate it. To the shadows she had clung, masking her presence and following at a distance, waiting as he entered the Supreme Chancellor's office just as closing hours neared. Words had been exchanged. A shot had been fired. He'd screamed for the guards. She'd nearly called them. At least, that had been her plan until she'd felt his presence warp and twist, seeping with the dark side of the Force. Then came the Force lightning. Then she'd acted, and gotten jolted for her troubles. She felt wretched. Why hadn't she listened? Why didn't she believe him? Now all she knew was this cold, hard floor pressing on her back and those muffled noises. Then she became aware of shuffling movements, her own shallow breathing, her blood rushing in her ears, the smell of charred flesh. Her flesh, she realized. Gradually, this eerie world of sound expanded to blurry images, pins and needles in her limbs, and louder words, though by no means less garbled. It felt like she was coming off of a heavy anesthetic. That, or one hell of what Naruto called a jinjutsu. As each of those sounds grew more distinct, he could hear a man calling to her, Ayla. When the doors were wrenched open, she stiffened, half expecting to find the Sith emerging. That fear was dashed as a head of blonde hair poked through the archway. Scarred and pitted by lightning, his armor seemed to smoke with ruin as he bolted towards her, battered and bruised, but unbowed. The ghost of a smile pulled at her pale lips as he tended to her. Naruto, you stubborn girl, he murmured, crouching down to touch her face. Why did you come? The Twi'lek gasped softly as healing chakra flooded her system, repairing the wounds inflicted on her body and Leku. A warm, almost euphoric feeling pooled in her limbs, pleasant as the injured flesh reduced in swells and painstakingly knitted itself back together. Should have trusted you. You'd better not pull this shit when we get to Mandalore, he muttered, but the words were without rancor. Can't have you slicing off fingers there, you know. Folks won't like that. I'll probably have to tell Celeste that, too. Mandalore. Her eyes glittered wetly as his fingers trailed her cheek. After all this, he was still willing to trust her. Fully mended, she felt well enough to rise. Gingerly, he helped her up to her feet. Her world swam like a great ocean, leaving her reeling slightly. Mandalore, he confirmed with a nod. I'm not giving up on you that easily. For what it's worth, I appreciate the assist. Her eyes watered all over again at what he said next. Thanks for coming, Ayla. Naruto, His lips touched hers as she heard the sounds of incoming footsteps. Seems reinforcements would be a bit quicker in arriving than they thought. They'd have some explaining to do. But she believed him, trusted him. It was there now, a burning brand in the back of her mind. When his mouth touched hers again, all she knew was bliss, and the years flowed like wind. 10 years later, when the dreams came again, the young Padawan wasn't prepared for them. It was as if everyone were made of glass and she the only living creature amongst them. The light glistened off their crystalline highlights, the blood ran fast over her smooth surface, and their expressions, a combined look of resignation and apology, a look that said they had failed her, and that she had failed them, drove a sharp point into the helpless onlooker's heart. She tried to reach out for them, tried to save them. "You can't." She resisted the silken call of that voice as cracks began to appear in the glass. She heard crunching sounds as they elongated, screamed as they shattered into thousands of pieces, helpless to do anything but watch in utter despair before the unseen onslaught. And above them all, the shadowed man. He grinned down at her, his crimson lightsaber filling her vision. And then, as it always did, the blade. "Farewell, little Togruta. Cut down, Nuwa." The Jedi Padawan jumped to a sighting position in her cot on the starship, her eyes popping open wide, sweat on her forehead and her breath coming in small gasps. A dream, she realized. It was all a dream. She told herself that repeatedly as she tried to settle back down on the cot. It was all a dream. Or was it? She could see things, after all, before they happened. Ahsoka, her mentor's voice called down from the cockpit. Nearly a decade had changed him from a fledgling boy into a strong man, having grown into his role as a Jedi. "We'll be approaching Coruscant shortly. Time to wake up." There was a pause as his rich voice seemed to consider what he'd just said. It wouldn't do to keep Senator Amidala waiting. Sighing, the young learner pushed herself up out of her cot. "Yes, Master Kenobi." Mandalore was a culture divided. Over the last decade, rising tensions and aggressive lobbying brought on by the increasingly ever-vocal separatists against the Republic had proved too much for the planet's government to handle. Unable to sustain an endless barrage of blows on its infrastructure, it had instead fractured, breaking up into 3 different groups, each with radically different goals for the planet and their people. Under Duchess Satine, the new Mandalorians called out for peace and neutrality, solidarity even. In the times that were to come, another, led by Pre Vizsla, favored outright war. They were more than willing to sell their services to either side, so long as they were paid at the end of the day. After the initial paroxysm of violence and of hostilities had passed, Jango Fett had washed his hands of the matter and elected to remain upon Kamino. In no uncertain terms would he intervene. They were left to fend for themselves while he tended to his secret business on the watery world. This unexpected dereliction of duty, all but announcing that he was no longer Mandalore, only broke the foundation even further. Still, the atmosphere on Mandalore was one of simmering uncertainty. It was peaceful enough on the surface even with this strong Death Watch presence, but the prospect of peace talks had created a temporary ceasefire of sorts even amidst the growing hostilities threatening war. It also created a vacuum. Into this power vacuum, the leader of the third and final faction, the Lords of Mandalore, emerged. No one knew what to make of them or their leader. He accepted any and everyone under his banner, claiming that one needn't be born on Mandalore to be Manda, that is, a true child of the people. There were even a few former Jedi seen under his banner. The man who led them was known to most, disdained to some. He was charismatic and loud-spoken, exuberant and loyal to a fault. Rather than try to eliminate the other factions, he wanted to unite them. And unlike most, he had a clear symbol to rally behind. The Mask of Mandalore, having been the one to obtain the mask from its place in that oh-so-distant world, the one to risk life and limb to find then wear it. His word carried more weight than others. He favored maintaining the old ways, but also doing their best to improve them. Supporting the Republic was a worthy goal in his mind as well. His skills were unorthodox, to be certain, but he was still one of them. Enough to be heard, then considered, and by the time any of the opposition viewed him as an actual threat, it was already too late. Unfortunately, the current owner of said mask was presently fighting for his life. Wham! Naruto grunted in surprise as a clawed paw slammed into his chest. The sheer, unexpected momentum of the blow sending him spinning into a bulkhead with all the force of a turboblaster. He lay there for a moment, sprawled in a senseless heap. Stars, whole galaxies jolted backward and forwards across his vision as he sat there, the world spinning before his vision. His gaze roamed the other rings where other bouts took place, a nasty-looking blaster-totting Devaronian squaring off against an unarmed Isla, nimbly making sport of her adversary. Like a leaf flowing with the breeze, always moving, reacting. Poetry in motion. Nothing could touch her. He still didn't understand why she insisted on following him to these matches provings. If you would, but he'd be lying if he didn't enjoy the show. It was part of the reason he hadn't gotten up yet. It was difficult not to admire those curves amidst the brown leathers she wore, to miss the subtle sheen of sweat on her visage, the way her leku twitched ever so lightly when her opponent had a near miss, and above all, that blazing, hot look of rapturous delight in her eyes whenever she scored a hit, whenever she caught him glancing at her, as she had now. Certainly, the life of mercenary seemed to agree with her. For someone who'd spent most of their life locking their emotions away, refusing to feel, to experience, to know the glory that was life, the former Jedi seemed to delight in expressing herself in almost any way possible now. A grown woman she might be, but she was almost childlike in that aspect. Even after the last decade he still found rather endearing, really cute even. The mask hid his sly smile, prevented anyone, even his impatient opponent, from seeing just how much he was enjoying himself watching her move. It also hid the way his eyes flashed when she took her opponent off his feet with a brutal sweep, swatting the blaster from his hand and discharging it in his face a moment later. Scarlet stained a sea of sapphire the color of blood as he observed the kill. Crisp, efficient. She'd chosen to fight unarmed against an expert marksman to make a point, and now she had. And, call me damn it, he wanted her so bad right now. Well, Kurama mused bemused, crossing his paws under his chin as their opponent, having grown tired of waiting, came charging in for the kill. You seem to be enjoying yourself. Need I remind you that you have a match of your own? Of course I am. It took all he had not to laugh aloud, that would have given him away. There's that of course, and I finally found myself a Wookiee. Levering himself upright at the very last moment, he slammed a boot foot into the furry mammal's chest, launching him halfway across the hastily erected ring with a truncated squeal of pain. And he's got an eye patch. An eye patch? How cool is that? Oi oi oi, what is it with you and pirates? All right, he called, picking himself up with an effort, stepping back into the fray, into the ring once more. I'll admit, I actually felt that one. He rolled his arms, muscles tensing as he prepared himself for what was undoubtedly the next round, the next assault. Not bad, Char. Not bad at all, umph. When the Wookiee hit, the words rushed out of him in a dry wheeze. Char was indeed a great, big, giant of a Wookiee, standing nearly a head taller than most of his kind. Now, Naruto was tall for human standards, but Char dwarfed even him. Endowed with strength, speed, and skill beyond most, he could make sport of even the most accomplished fighter. To make matters even more interesting, the Mandalorian wasn't wearing any armor, just a simple bandolier of ammunitions he'd neglected to discard over his large torso, something that seemed to make him look all the more imposing. By contrast, he seemed almost normal. The Menace had opted for a simple black tunic himself, foregoing both his arms and armor, even chakra and the force itself for the sake of fairness. And had it been a simple matter of strength, he would have been beaten into the ground in the first round. But while Naruto wasn't quite nearly so large as his adversary, and though he was deliberately handicapping himself, he still had something that Char did not. Something that preceded his arrival in this strange galaxy. Something that allowed him to stand head and shoulders above the rest. He had guts, and that made him more than a match for Char in terms of sheer strength. Char just didn't know it yet. There, Naruto grunted now as the Wookiee slammed into him with a roar, nearly driving him to a knee before he steadied himself, boots biting harshly down into the durasteel floor. Momentum ground to a halt. He held on that position for a long moment, unmoving, the mask of Mandalore concealing his small, satisfied smile. Then he counterattacked. A piston kick to the stomach cracked a rib, gave the blonde some breathing room, and then it was over, allowing him to truly take the fight to his hairy adversary for the first time since the fight had begun. Aura. With a mighty heave he grabbed the Wookiee in a full Nelson and smashed him down to the floor, stunning him. Even then, the Wookiee didn't give in. He tried to rise and Naruto savagely smashed him back down with a double fist to the head, eliciting a FURYYY's bestial snarl. Then he set about ruining the alien's day in the worst way he could, by relentlessly pounding him with every physical trick in his arsenal. Every hold, grapple, and underhanded move he'd learnt over the last 2 decades, engraved into his opponent's body. In short, he beat the living cark out of Char. Which wasn't to say that the Wookiee didn't get in a few good shots of his own. He gave as good as he got. One such blow sent the blonde's ears ringing, broke a wrist, and another fractured a collarbone, sending ringlets of pain shooting through his chest. Naruto took it all stoically, accepted each shot, and soldiered on. He let the pain fuel him, drive him, used it to drive his enemy into a frenzy, never once ceasing in his assault. He was wrath incarnate, no mercy was given, and none expected. This was single combat, the prize being the mask Naruto wore, and by rights, leadership of the Lords of Mandalore itself. Whomever won the day would be subservient to the other. It was just that simple. Naruto had agreed to the terms at the outset. So had Char. Neither were willing to give in. So when he finally pinned his understandably enraged opponent on the ground, securing his skull beneath a boot and one giant forearm behind his back, he was surprised when the latter did just that. He'd stretched the limb to the breaking point, and one more tug would have done serious damage, when Char simply gave up and stopped fighting. Some of the spectators booed, their fellow Mandalorians baffled as to why the Wookiee would throw in the towel after only 3 rounds. Naruto saw the opportunity and pounced, wrenching Char's arm hard enough to elicit a snarl. "Do you yield?" The Wookiee nodded into the ground, groaned in agreement, one that Naruto understood readily enough. "I yield. My life is yours." That was all he needed to hear. "Excellent." Laughing aloud, he hopped off the Wookiee's back, ripped off his mask and offered his fellow Mando a hand. Char looked at him, seemed to consider his palm for a moment, then accepted, gripping his palm. What came next was a most pleasant surprise indeed. With a triumphant roar, fangs bared in a wide grin, the Wookiee hauled his arm into the air, thankfully still attached, his throaty bellow arcing out across the ring. One needed no translator to understand his intention. To the victor, a roar rose up from the crowd, some pleased with the outcome, others not so much, and a few figures slunk away, seemingly unnoticed. Naruto tactfully pretended not to notice the agents of Vizsla or Satine reporting back to their masters, slipping away from the throng of people come to watch him fight. Let them talk, he mused, sliding the mask of Mandalore over his face once more. Let them wonder what he was planning, plotting or conniving. It didn't matter. He would take on all comers, and, in the end, would succeed. Of that much, he had no doubt. But for now it was time to celebrate. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Isla, still slumped near the body of her opponent. When he went to her, Char and half the sodding crowd went with him. Isla still didn't budge. For a moment, he almost thought she was mourning, but when she looked up at him, he saw only exhaustion in those warm, caramel orbs. "You all right?" Isla smiled sheepishly. I can't move my legs." She flushed a little at his confusion. "It's been a while since I fought without the Force," she added in a quiet aside. "It's draining." He looked at her in confusion for a little while at that, but then his brain finally connected to his ears and comprehension dawned. He smiled widely at her predicament, though he had the good grace to look apologetic, and she would have hit him had she had the strength. "No choice then, I guess. Up we go." "Wa Naruto, what are you doing?" She squeaked in surprise as vertigo set in when she was unceremoniously picked up like she weighed less than nothing. Her heart swelled with warmth when she realized she was being held like a bride in the strong arms of her love, and suddenly she was thanking every deity she could think of for her previously humiliating situation. She had never noticed how broad his chest was before, but being held against it like she was made her realize how small she was in comparison. The constant, rhythmic motions of his steps set a counterpoint to the beat of his heart, and the heady fragrance of sweat mingled with the telltale scent of ramen and his own light cologne to lull her into an almost dreamlike state. She all but turned into lovesick while she rested her head against him. The crowd hooted, some of the men firing off appreciative whistles. She staunchly ignored them, allowing herself this one moment of quiet weakness. Yes, there was where she belonged. With him. Always. Forever. Naruto laughed. To victory. Victroy. Raising his other hand, he echoed the crowd's shout with one of his own, a fierce bellow that put Char to shame. Then he walked away, Isla in his arms and Char at his back, his hard-won ally following close behind in their stead. The crowd finally dispersing at their backs. He felt inordinately pleased with himself. And why not? He'd accomplished his objective for the day. Halfway across the planet, Anakinskywalker's day was just beginning. His long arms pumped relentlessly with a rhythm born from years of practice, the blue blade of his lightsaber weaving an aggressive tapestry of light between him and his opponent. But try as he might, he simply could not find a way to penetrate the man's defenses. Jade battled against Azure again and again and again, bars of light hitting, spitting, then splitting apart only to dance together once more. Sweat beaded upon his brow, a vein pulsing in his forehead as he fought off the urge to simply lash out and crush his opponent. It would be so easy. Concentrate, Annie. Qui-Gon's voice penetrated the wall of light. You're slipping. Focus. Find your center. I hate that name. With anger came a renewed sense of purpose, his frustration becoming his strength, driving him forward, ever forwards. Focus, a little voice whispered in his head, urging him on, demanding that he succeed, that he be the best, that he triumph. You're stronger than him. You have more strength, stamina, use them. So he did, attacking with renewed ferocity, always striking, ever striking until finally there. He caught just a tiny flicker of fear in the former Jedi's face, a hesitation between the older man's seemingly impenetrable Sorsu defense. With a final surge of strength he pushed forward and swatted Qui-Gon's blade down into the floor, momentarily trapping it there. Then, before he could recover, Anakin struck upwards, slashing angrily, driving his blade into the opening presented him. And then Celeste Morn was there, her blade a golden razor at his flank as it intercepted him. In the instant that he would have almost certainly struck a telling blow, the ancient Jedi intervened and stopped his blade from rending his mentor in twine. Shame filled him. He'd nearly cut him down. It didn't last. Rage and righteous fury flowed through young Skywalker and he rounded on her, saber flashing. Before he could protest, she extended her hand and a jagged swath of force lightning slammed into him. Every muscle in his body, every single cell clamped down as one. Against every demand produced by his brain, a terrible weakness took hold and forced him to his knees, gasping for air. She lowered her hand and the pain alongside the lightning left him, leaving him there on the floor, reeling. But his humiliation was short-lived. A moment later his hearing returned, just in time for her to berate him. "What are you thinking?" She snapped at him, her normally soothing voice turning shrill with outrage. "Your saber doesn't have a training setting. You could have killed him." Her own lightsaber, a saber staff, spun like an angry wasp, yellow lights blurring furiously in her hands before she extinguished it. Righteous fury boiled over her like a lava flow on Mustafar. "Oh, I even had to stop my lesson with the kids." Cool off," she snapped, shooting him a heated glare as she snatched the lightsaber from his still nerveless fingers. "You're done for the day unless your old man says otherwise." Anakin struggled to raise his head, a monumental effort given the state of his body, and rasped, "But I said you're done." Something black and unholy flashed in his eyes. "No, I am not. Anakinskywalker." When SHMI spoke, Anakin listened. He always had. It had been that way since time immemorial. He'd always obeyed her. And when he saw her, storming into the compound, eyes flashing, he knew at once that he would listen. Her youthful face was creased with worry for him, concern for Qui-Gon, and there, beneath it all, a grain of anger that he'd lost himself to his anger. Again, he hung his head, looking away at her approach. Qui-Gon met his stare even, his expressionly odd and unreadable. Why did he feel so ashamed? "Why, Mama's right," a new, younger voice cried. "You can't get angry. That's bad." He glanced down, realizing at once that she hadn't come alone. He'd nearly forgotten about them. She'd brought the twins. Lara was technically older, born by a mere minute. She was the spitting image of her mother, with dark hair, a cherubic face, and strangely violet eyes. By contrast, Sarah's eyes were a startling shade of blue, her bleak black tresses bearing a strange mark of gold throughout, very much reminiscent of her father's. Both were skilled with a blade, practitioners of Jarkai and Jai, perhaps even better than him, and both annoyed him to no end. They were just so frustrating. "You can't do that," Lara insisted, repeating. "You can't get angry, because that would make Mama and Papa angry, right?" Sarah finished. "Right?" The twins grinned as one. "I'm not even going to gratify that with a response." Anakin ruthlessly bit back a scowl, fighting the urge to bark at them for saying such things. He loved his little sisters, he really did, but they could be such a pain sometimes. Their endless habit of finishing one another's sentences was irritable enough, but to be made a fool by them, in front of his family no less. Shame colored his cheeks at the thought. Oi, what's going on here?" "Ani, over here, on the double." Oh, this was not going to end well. The twins grinned again as a new, warm presence arrived in the hangar. "Papa," Anakin dared to turn. What he saw there baffled him. Naruto was holding up a comlink and a sheet of flimsiplast, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Ani, get your things. We're going to Coruscant." Why? To see your girlfriend," came the cheery reply. "Seems someone tried to kill her." His son flushed a deep, vibrant red, grateful, yet intensely embarrassed all at once. "She is not my girlfriend." "Oh, I seem to recall you mentioning you wanted to stick your tongue down her." "Dad." Wham! A hatch slammed down on the dock with a dull clank of sound. For a moment there was silence on the landing pad, broken only by the stifled sound of smoldering engines, stilled and yet warm from its rough, if not abrupt landing. The guards regarded the craft warily, their helmeted heads staring in abject disbelief at the hulking ship no more than a few yards away. The darkness of the ship's hold seemed to beckon invitingly, daring them to enter. A shared glance was exchanged, but neither moved towards the vessel. They knew precisely who this vessel belonged to, and they were entirely loath to approach it, the both of them. This was no ordinary freighter. It was one of darkness and death, one they'd no desire to approach, a ship they would have, by rights, avoided if they could. Sadly, doing so would result in not only a thorough chewing out from their superiors, but likely result in the loss of their lives. "Well," the left said, "what are you waiting for? Don't look at me." The rightmost sentry grumbled, unmoving. "You've heard the stories about him." "Stories? Yeah, stories," his companion answered, glowering behind the helmet. "That's the Mandalore's ship. The guy who yanks fucking fleets out of the sky with his mind. I'm not going anywhere near that. Think he's here for an alliance. Why else would Supreme Chancellor Organa ask him out here, eh? Still, I'm not going anywhere near." Whatever else he might have said died as a harsh rattle emanated from the bowels of the ship. Both guards froze, exchanged a glance, another rattle, and they took off as if they very hounds of hell were at their heels, fleeing for the elevator. Not a moment too soon, either. A figure resplendent in Mandalorian armor burst out as though he'd been fired from a cannon. "Asu," he cried. "I'm back, Coruscant. Did ya miss me, baby?" The young man at his side deadpanned slightly. "I don't think it did, Dad." Libel. Naruto's fist pumped upward once more, his boots descending with sharp decisive motion as they disembarked from the Konoha, the motion echoing the hoarse boom of his laughter that was its precursor. Those vocal cords, though still scarred by Sidious's savage Sith lightning 10 years ago, hadn't lost any of their luster, Anakin thought. If anything, they seemed to have grown even more boisterous than ever before, determined to defy his old wounds. He supposed that was what made Naruto his father. After all, he wasn't good, bad, or even gray when it came to terms of morality. He just was. There was just something about him that drew you in, you know. Like gravity, a black hole pulling you inexorably closer. Call it charisma, call it charm, whatever the word was. He made friends, lovers in particular, with an ease that defied belief. For Anakin, it was the opposite. More and more he found himself increasingly disconnected from his progenitor. Distanced even, since that day, 10 years ago. The seed had been planted that very day, and try as he might, he couldn't seem to root it out. Because for all his kindness and care and charm, his father was a hypocrite. Why couldn't Mom be enough for him? Would he never be satisfied? He had Isla and Celeste. He also secretly suspected the Twi'lek twins being in on the whole debacle in addition to his mother, someone he had nigh but sworn himself to, only to revoke his word when she gave him permission. So, yes, hypocrite. Yet if he were truly honest with himself, it ran deeper than that. Ever since the twins had been born, he'd felt wholly out of place, a third wheel, if you will. Not that Naruto didn't pay him any mind. He did. But, was there such a thing as too much attention? He glanced back at his parent, clad as ever in his armor, and wondered, where did he fit in all of this? Try as he might, he felt tense, dissatisfied, angry even. But at who? His father, his mother, or was it himself? He didn't know. It was maddening. "You keep sulking like that, boy," Naruto muttered, the words echoing behind the helmet. "And I'm gonna have to stick you under a waterfall to cool off." Catching that viscered gaze, the youth found himself once more biting back a retort of his own. "It's nothing," he muttered. "Nothing." His father pressed a button on his wrist, and the helmet unfolded, exposing whiskered cheeks and a scowl. "You're brooding like Sasuke, for crying out loud. What's wrong with you? I thought you'd be damn happy to see Padme after all those years." Those words gave Annie pause, if only briefly. "What's a Sasuke?" "The most emo there ever was," the blonde replied sagely, raising a finger. "Right and proper prick, he was. Trust me, you don't want to know, right?" Clapping him on the shoulder, the shinobi stepped closer, pinning him with those bright blue eyes. "You want to tell me what this is about, or are you gonna keep moping?" "Because I was just kidding about the waterfall bit. Can we not do this right now?" Try as he might, Annie couldn't bring his anger to bear on his father. The flames of his ire guttered out beneath that gaze, a tiny candle in the wind. "Have it your way." He shrugged. "You don't talk about it, it's gonna eat you up, though." Resigning himself to follow in the footsteps of his father, he took the moment to distract himself with the scenery. Anything, really. The skylines of Coruscant teemed with activity around them, skylines bustling with activity and light. Though the hour was growing late, shards of sunlight painting the horizon, shades of ambery orange stretching across the horizon as far as the eye could see. It was here that they would be meeting the Supreme Chancellor and his retinue. To be honest, the thought made Anakin chafe. He couldn't quite explain why he was so antsy, only that that the Force was trying to tell him something. But what? If he focused, he thought he could feel it, a niggling sense of danger. "Now then, where's that girl of yours?" "Ah, and there it went again." Anakin groaned aloud, desperately wishing a meteor would fall from the heavens and wipe him from existence. Really, it should, because any moment now he was going to die from embarrassment. As ever, his father's behavior floored him, as wild and unpredictable as a seething storm, albeit one who seemed to enjoy making mischief than anything else. Honestly, how could he possibly be related to this man? Words alone could not even begin to express this feeling, this constant swing from respecting his father one moment to hating him the next. Frustrated. Yes, that was it. To the point where he just wanted to get away from the well-meaning man. He knew his father wasn't a bad person. Really, he did. It was just... What was it exactly that drove him to such fits when in his progenitor's presence? Try as he might, he just couldn't suss it out. Alright, Naruto turned his head abruptly, craning his neck in the direction of the hold, everybody out. Their little gallery of rogues, their ragtag band of misfits and outcasts both, pandered down the ramp shortly thereafter. Celeste, ironically, the most aloof member of their little family, was the first to emerge. The ancient Jedi walked down the ramp with a sense of almost deific reverence, wide-eyed as she stepped onto the surface of the planet. Belatedly, it occurred to Anakin that this was a homecoming for her, of course. Qui-Gon trailed after her, his stoic visage betraying the slightest nostalgia at visiting the capital once more. Vet and Set were not far behind him, their bright eyes alert and vigilant, blasters not drawn, but still close at hand. Flanked by these silent sentries, Shinobi emerged. She wore the patient smile of a woman who was accustomed to such things, though the dark state of her dress and light body armor told a different story. She, too, was expecting trouble here this evening. Indeed, the assortment of blasters and vibro blades in her bandolier spoke volumes to that assessment. Even so, she still managed to look humble despite the "this isn't necessary, you know." "Yes, it is," Naruto argued stubbornly, shaking his head. "We're here to help an old friend, I don't want any surprises." A slender brow was arched. "Funny, I seem to recall you saying the same thing when you found out I could shoot." "Simir, you." He took her close, kissing her softly. Anakin felt his stomach churn at the sight, pushing it from his mind. A tweedling Sparky trundled down shortly thereafter, accompanied by an overly excited HK-47. Statement, "Ah, at last, Coruscant." The droid inhaled sharply as he clanked to a stop on the dock and gazed about the evening sky, as if he could actually taste the cold air, which was of course absolute rubbish. Query, "I wonder how many meatbags Master will let me kill this evening." Shmi hid a small smile behind her hand. "I wouldn't bet on that," Aula quipped, striding past him. "Not with that rusty old rifle." A scoffing sound interrupted her. Recitation. "First, weapon selection is critical. My weapon has been upgraded to exterminator status." He paused then, suddenly realizing he'd actually been mocked by the rogue Jedi. Had his metal chassis possessed the ability to bristle, it most certainly would have. Additional statement, "If I hear one more idiot insults my firearm, then I'll kill them myself." Aula frowned, planting a hand on her hip. "Not if I stop you." "You would try, meatbag woman?" Those bright red eyes fixed on her intently. "It would a shame to kill such an efficient meatbag such as you, but if the Master commanded." "And how would you kill a rogue Jedi, exactly?" she challenged. The hunter-killer droid seemed to visibly draw himself up with pride. "Confession, countering your powers is difficult, as I do not fully understand the range of all your abilities, but I do know that many of them require that the Jedi know you is there and able to see you. Thus sniping and using cover are always advantageous." He paused, servos whirring. Addendum, a technique that Revan used frequently was to attack Jedi meatbags indirectly. This method only works if the Jedi is adhering to the self-destructive path of pacifism and sacrifice, which you are not. Faced with such a simple admission, Aula gawped. Naruto whistled, observing the proceedings with thinly veiled amusement. "Hey, he got you there." Not helping. And last but not least came Char. The great giant of a Wookiee seemed to dwarf everyone else, even his father. This was made somewhat less menacing by the presence of Lara and Sarah perched on his shoulders. A low rumble reverberated through his throat as he observed their surroundings. "Yeah, I know. Talk about clandestine." Whatever else he might have said dissolved into a sharp cry of delight as the elevator, the very same one by which the terrified guards had departed, whirred open. A regal-looking man in deep blue vestments emerged, flanked by a trio of thankfully more stoic guards, their rich cobalt robes seeming to shimmer in the light of the waning sun. Naruto shoved them aside, shouldering his way to the man at the center. The guardsmen bristled at his rough approach, but lowered their weapons as their leader raised a hand. "Bail, how have you been, you bastard?" "Well, my friend." Bail Organa, Supreme Chancellor of the Republic, clasped his arm firmly. Naruto wasn't having any of that, however, and pulled the man into a firm embrace, slapping him on the back. If there was one thing he could be proud of, it was that his father never did anything by halves. The Chancellor himself grunted in surprise, shock showing for but a moment before he returned it. "Aw, this brings back memories." Naruto laughed, drawing away. "Looks like being in charge agrees with you since I off Palpatine." Wait. A pause, followed by a blink. "Wait, where's Padme?" The former senator's face turned grave. "You haven't heard." Naruto frowned. "Haven't heard what?" Some hours later, into the evening. He had the shot. Django saw the senator lying in her bed, snug as a bug in a rug, and stubbornly quelled the urge to act. He felt his finger twitch on the trigger, demanding it, and stilled himself. How easy it would be. With a rifle like this, a single shot would more than suffice. One shot would render her head a red smear on the wall. They wouldn't even recognize her. He was certain he was hidden here on the rooftop, safe from all prying eyes amidst the girders of the skyscraper. Twitch, a simple squeeze and it would all be over. Zam would have been an ideal choice for such a task, he knew. He'd almost had her do it herself. But with the boy about, he was leaving nothing to chance. Best to get in and out before the kid got suspicious. He wasn't the sort to let a bone go when you tossed it at him. And this was the mother of all bones. Once he got a hold of this, he wouldn't be letting go. This was the reason he hadn't taken the shot ... yet. Because he knew Naruto was probably out there, waiting. The kid was good, damn good, but even he wasn't skilled enough to deflect a shot like this. Not at a speed like this. Then Padme turned to smoke in his scope, revealing a smirking blonde. Said blonde promptly raised a hand and fired off a one-fingered salute. Shit. Django blinked. Once, twice, 3 times. Then he started swearing. Oh, that criffing little basta. Long time no see. Django nearly spit bolts as an angry hiss snaked into his ear. It took everything he had not to flail around as. I'm afraid you'll have to tell me about your employers now, old friend. To his disbelief, his mentor actually surprised him. Because he laughed. You're not the only one who's learned a new trick. Django's body flickered suddenly, like a wavy image distorted by water. His smile frozen. And then the man sputtered and died altogether, vanishing with a dull pop of electricity. Naruto stood there for a long moment, agape, trying to figure out what the hell just happened. Then he saw the emitter, sparking quietly in a pool of oil. Reaching down for it, he recognized the small device for what it was almost immediately. Hologram. Naruto felt his eyes narrow. In the next instant, he felt hot metal press against his skull. Shit. Time seemed to slow. The blaster at the back of his head, its emitter nozzle still warm. Set to kill, not stun. His finger on the trigger, the one man whom he'd trusted, listened to, thought of as a friend. Was it really going to end like this? Django, don't do this. Sorry, kid. A blaster fired. VZZM. Naruto never saw the lightsaber ignite, but he certainly saw Celeste's stunned face. She stared back at him in disbelief, the rains of the storm highlighting her stricken expression. Hell, his mouth coughed blood. That's not good. Naruto. Just as he felt her shock, he felt the angry red blade slice through his chest and into his heart. Saw it. That blazing sword, thrust clear through his ribs, emerged before him. Pain, burning, searing, coursing through him in a hot wave of agony. Typical. His mind berated him. The one time you don't wear your armor, and this is what happens. He stood there for a long moment, gazing down at the blazing tip. Shock and incredulity warred within him, as fierce as a nova's glow. But amidst it all, one emotion rose over the rest as he turned his head, saw the face of his killer. Disappointment. How? That was all he saw before a flash of red cut across his vision. Emwa. Naruto woke from the dream, vision with a jolt, roaring in outrage and straining against his shackles. Wait, shackles. Indignant rage warred with incredulous shock and the former won out, a throaty snarl snaking through clenched teeth. Django. I swear to God. But Django Fett wasn't here. What was there were the shackles, ray shielded if his attempts to escape were any indication. Whomever had designed these bonds knew their craft, enough to force his arms to his sides and legs to his chest, and then bind them there with Beskar steel, preventing him from exerting any of his prodigious strengths in a meaningful effort. By the time he remembered who he was and what had transpired, the blonde was positively seething with rage. Django. The fool hadn't wanted him dead at all. He'd been stunned. The coward. Now, as wakefulness returned to him in fits and spurts, Naruto knew he'd truly been had. The realization galled him, angered him more than he cared to admit. He'd let his guard down, thought himself invincible, and his arrogance had cost him most dear. Someone that scruffy nerf herder of a mentor no doubt had spirited away his helmet and weapons, as well as his comlink. They'd even stripped him of his armor and both boots, leaving him in the blue-black tunic beneath. Typical Django, accounting for everything. All that awaited him when he opened his eyes were 4 ugly brown steel walls and a ceiling. No door. Nothing beyond this flat, emotionless surface, which was doubtlessly the point. If there was a door or a way out, he couldn't see them. As expected, his room or a prison, perhaps, itself afforded precious little in the way of possessions or furnishings. Oddly enough, however, someone had placed a small pitcher of water was waiting for him near his feet. At least he hoped it was water. After a moment's hesitation, Naruto flared his Rinnegan in an attempt to pick it up. Arg! Sparks jolted down his shackles and into spine, stripping him of strength and concentration both. Slumping, his body steaming from sudden surge, the Shinobi Menace hissed softly. A tiny plume of smoke snaked past his lips. Okay, that hurt. Naruto coughed dryly, idly aware of the fact that he'd just cooked himself inside his armor. Problematic. Inspecting the pitcher anew confirmed it housed just enough for a singed mouthful. Naruto eyed it, sorely tempted to try again. what he wouldn't give for a drink to quench his parched throat. But to reach it he'd have to resort to his eyes or the Force, neither of which would result in anything less than blistering pain. He was no stranger to such things of course, but neither was he about to go to such great lengths merely to slake his thirst. SHMI would laugh herself silly if she saw him trussed up like this. The great Shinobi Menace, caught off guard by some up-jumped bounty hunter, Ayla and the others would never let him live this down. Of course, he mused, he could always use the pitcher as a weapon if he got a hold of it. Maybe enough to blast open the wall if he put enough force behind it, assuming the shock didn't immobilize him outright. Enough to surprise whomever came to get him, certainly. If they came to get him. He laughed to think what other, darker purpose the water might serve. Were they going to leave him here to die of thirst, with water so easily within reach? Or perhaps it was there just to show how powerless they thought he was. Resigning himself to immobility, the ninja willed his body to relax against his bonds, slumping until the Beskar joints turned slack. Perhaps if he exerted the full of his strength he could break them. But then where would he be? He had no idea where he was, or even what planet he was on. Fighting his way to freedom was one thing. The burning desire to know what the hell was going on, another. If Django was here, so were the answers he sought. Answers to why his old friend had turned on him. How he'd caught him by surprise. Who he was working for. Fine, he'd play their little game until the mastermind revealed themselves. There were other tricks and tools of the trade he could use. The idea of scorching his bonds away with a spat fire jutsu was even less appealing than the idea of having to regenerate his scorched flesh. As long as he could escape. As if summoned by that very thought, however, the wall slid open with a soft chime. To the angry sound of blaster bolts and a deadly, familiar thrum of a blade. Naruto inhaled sharply, the retort dying on his lips. Fire, fire, a thin, reedy voice was crying. That of a droid's, he thought. We can't let him reach the prisoner. Roger, Roger, ga. That deadly thrumming noise buzzed into life once more, cutting the voice down and hurling it inside. Naruto recognized the broken pile of metal immediately as the spindly form of a Trade Federation battle droid. These things, what were they doing here? As he gazed down at the smoldering scrap heap, a shadow fell over him, blotting out the light. Hello, my friend. A deep, amused voice chilled him to the bone. It's been a long time. Waiting for him was a regal, impeccably dressed man in dull brown and gray robes. Elderly but evidently still spry in his old age despite his salt and pepper beard nevertheless. The newcomer seemed genuinely pleased to see him, if the smile was any sort of indication. Naruto didn't recognize him. Dark eyes fixed on him intently as he drew near. Slow and measured footfalls carried the newcomer him down the steps, favoring his right leg ever so slightly as he strode forward. Naruto couldn't help but feel puzzled by the stranger's recognition of him. Just who in blazes was this old sod? Right, it's you all, I'm that guy. I see you don't recognize me, after all. The man's hand swung aside and to the right, sweeping the cloak aside to reveal the crooked lightsaber hilt at his hip. We dueled some time ago on Naboo. Perhaps this will jog your memory. VCCM. When his strange host ignited said saber, it burned a bright and intense silver color, not red as he'd secretly suspected. In the next instant that same saber swung backward, stabbing into the mechanism holding Naruto aloft with an audible crunch of shattered circuits and steel, leaving little more than a smoking ruin behind. The weapon completed its sweep and extinguished, shrinking back into a hilt before the blonde could even begin to drop to the floor. Without so much as a cursory glance back at him, his rescuer returned the hilt to his belt. Oh, Naruto struck the ground with an audible yelp, still bound by the shackles, but freed from limbo and gravity. And as he lay there, a spark of recognition burned itself into his brain at the effortless, if a tad arrogant, flourish just then. The way that he had moved about the room with impunity. Those eyes, the saber, that voice. For the first time since he'd woken on this ramen-forsaken rock, the Mandalore found himself smiling. Dooku, he exclaimed, laughing. Shit, you got old. Thought you left the Jedi. The ghost of a smile on that bearded face was all the answer he needed. For a time, the older man confessed, turning his head. I required clarity, peace of mind. I understand you've been quite active yourself since we last spoke. A sheepish laugh followed. Not really. No. A silver brow arched itself curiously, reviving an ancient Jedi, establishing yourself as the leader of the most powerful mercenary bands in the Outer Rim. Becoming Mandalore, slaying a Sith Lord. I shudder to think of what you might call busy, then. Look, are we going to talk all day or free me? Naruto grunted. I've got things to do, stuff to steal, people to kill. The man's smile thinned. Crass as ever, I see. Dark eyes flicked to his shackles. I suppose you want me to cut you loose, then. Please don't. The scar bindings. It wouldn't be pleasant. Very well. A hand waved, shattering the Beskar binders on his legs and allowing the blonde to climb shakily to his feet. I must confess, I wasn't expecting to find you here. Naruto shot his rescuer a dirty look, but held his tongue as he shook himself down. Where is here, anyway? Genosis. Dooku spat the word as if it were poison. A world no man should visit. Naruto cringed slightly. The bug planet. The very same. Beckoning him over, the once former Jedi indicated the band of steel encircling his arms. I'm not seeing a switch. Can you break these? He was still speaking when Naruto reached around and pressed a finger to the tip of his restraints. Just a touch, a single, pinpoint use of pressure, and the Beskar binding him shattered like so much glass. Dooku took a short step back, balking slightly. His expression was telling. It must have been because Naruto laughed. Fascinating, he mused, gazing at the shattered shards of Mandalorian steel. How did you? Shatterpoint. The blonde answered with a smirk, rolling his shoulders and wriggling his fingers. You pick up all sorts of tricks when you have the willingness to learn. A useful talent. Dooku nodded as the blonde swept past, falling into step with him moments later. Perhaps you could teach me it sometime. Maybe. Naruto muttered, cross. Let's get out of here, first. A twitch of his fingers summoned the fallen droid's blaster to his hand as he stepped over it, the large blaster slapping awkwardly into his right hand. Large and unwieldy, he honestly considered leaving it behind before deciding better of it. Without his arms and armor he was still a force to be reckoned with, but put enough holes in him, hit him in the right spot, and he'd still go down. Better an uncivilized weapon than none at all. So, he asked at last as they edged out into the hall. What brings you here? The old count shook his head. I'm afraid my business here is slightly less noble than yours. Do tell. A blonde brow arched itself at the fallen bodies littering the corridor. Some of them were machines, others bug-like creatures he could only assume were Genosians. Dooku stepped right over them as though they didn't even exist, and Naruto was half inclined to do the same and be done with it. Yet something nagged at him. A thorn of doubt pricked his heart and held him back from simply ignoring the prone bodies beneath his feet like so much chattel. This was too easy. Whether it was the force of merely his own common sense, a foreboding that something had gone wrong. Oddly enough, it wasn't Dooku from whom he felt this strange sensation. The former Jedi felt strangely calm, even almost balanced by comparison. This was something else, something darker, something more. There was a presence here, something or someone waiting for them up ahead. The thought of it made him shudder, chilled by it. Sidious. No, Sidious was dead. This felt different. Whatever lay ahead felt vile, fouler than the deepest, darkest pit, and nigh impregnable to even his senses. And it hated him. Do you sense it? Dooku asked. It knows we are here. Naruto nodded. Why are you here again? He asked quietly. For a moment Dooku seemed strangely reticent. He held his tongue and hastened his pace, moving ahead and falling out of pace with him. Naruto frowned, and was just about to comment on the silence of his rescuer when the Count finally spoke. I have come here to destroy the Separatists and the Sith, he admitted at last, shoulders sagging. Their leaders are here, on this very planet. Naruto exhaled vigorously through his nose, snorting. Wow, that's pretty damn ballsy of ya. The first one, at least, he drawled, darting past his guide. But the second's impossible, considering I killed Sidious years ago and Maul before him. There shouldn't be any Sith left. Believe me, I made sure. There can't be anyone else out there. Whatever that thing is up there, it's not Sith. Can't be. Are you certain? Naruto blinked. What? Hate can be a powerful thing, Dooku warned. I speak from experience. Sith have been known to survive far worse injuries than the ones you described. It is possible that they are dead, Naruto replied, thrusting his face towards Dooku's own. Sidious and Maul both. This isn't them. It can't be. To admit that it was would mean that he had failed all those years ago. It would mean he was wrong. That Anakin wasn't safe, his family wasn't safe. As a father, he wanted nothing more than to quit this planet and race home right away to protect them from any and all harm. But he couldn't. They were in danger, and for the first time in his life, there was nothing he could do to protect them. Or he thought of it was almost enough. Qui-Gon's master wouldn't be cowed so easily. However, 10 years is a great time to recover. Dooku, I do not know if Maul or Sidious are the ones of which you speak. The ex-Jedi relented gently under the weight of his wrath. Only that the Sith themselves are responsible for everything transpiring here. The bounty hunter who brought you here. He serves whomever awaits us. I nearly served such a man myself, once. However, at the bounty hunter's admonishing look, the former Count sighed wearily. Our discussion on Naboo left me with much to dwell on. I felt the Jedi weren't living up to their potential. In the same vein, the Sith threatened to be the undoing of everything I'd worked towards. In the end, I chose my own path. Not light or dark, but gray. Meaning I am willing to go whatever lengths necessary. Naruto's glare didn't relent, and Dooku returned it with a blaze of his own. I am not your enemy, Mandalore. We'll see. So basically you want to kick ass and take names, right? Dooku bristled. I'd use more eloquent terms, but yes, I am confident in my plan. I had expected to face this darkness alone until I sensed you, or rather, the lack of you. Naruto realized. Dooku spoke about his density within the Force. That was a rather unique way to locate him. The only question is, will you join me? To be fair, I'm here for Django, and you may have him. Dooku conceded. He is not my target. Do we have an accord? Naruto eyed the offered hand warily. Then he shrugged and shook. What the hell? I haven't had a good fight in an age. Just as well, given what's transpired. Most of your allies believe you're quite indisposed. The blood froze in his very veins. Wait, what do you mean, indisposed? Dooku grimaced. I'm afraid they may have been given leave to believe you are. That was all he got out before Naruto heard the telltale clank of approaching droids. This way, Dooku hissed softly, spinning about, only to find the same cacophony proceeding from the cell block. The distant shadows and the sheer number of them were problematic, to say the least. Prepare yourself. Meanwhile on Coruscant, dead, Celeste took the news like a blaster bolt to the gut. Like a darkened knife she couldn't define, the pain slid under her ribs and pierced her heart. All of her strength, her resolve, her determination, it all dropped away in an instant. The room seemed to swim around her, the Konoha swaying as though it were caught in an invisible current at the bottom of a great red sea. Against her better judgment, she felt her temper get the better of her. Did you say he's dead? Obi-Wan nods slowly, the stiffness of his bearded jaw conveying all she needs to know. We're not certain, but there's a good chance of. The former host of the Muir talisman folded in on herself, collapsing back into a chair as Obi-Wan droned onto the others. She tried to listen to the rest of the Jedi's report, but it was impossible. Words faded into mere static, the rest of the world falling away like the faded colors of an old tapestry, worn and torn. Sparky trundled up to the despondent woman and bleeped an inquiry. Morn didn't so much as twitch. Eventually the droid gave up and wheeled away to the right, passing a despondent vet and set. Morn barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, lost in memory. He couldn't be dead. He'd promised her. Only a few hours ago everything had been so different. Flashback, some hours earlier. Celeste Morn stood on holy ground. At least it was holy in her mind. This was the place where the Sith Darth Sidious had fallen, where they'd been struck down once and for all. Not by justice, not by the Jedi, but by a man. That man stood only a few feet away, conversing amicably with Chancellor Organa baffled her even more. Were one to see him here, smiling, laughing without his helmet, he appeared almost normal. Were it not for the extensive armor and arms, she might have mistaken him for some nameless degenerate, not worthy of her time. Snatches of conversation trickled into her ear as she listened. Assign 2 Jedi to help you. Depends on the Jedi. Obi-Wankenobi and his Padawan Ahsoka. Celeste's mouth curled into a thin, flat line of annoyance. Jedi. Naruto. He was different. He was not a Jedi. He was not chosen, and yet had destroyed the Sith. Freed her from centuries of stasis. What did that make him, then, and what did that make her? With one battle he had brought 10 years of peace of prosperity to the Republic. Dark eyes roamed the horizon beyond the glass, her feet shifting restlessly as she eyed the scorched metal. Even years after the fact, the damage still remained. Oh, the transparasteel had been repaired and the metal had been molded back into place, but the real damage remained. The Force saturated this room, offering glimpses of battle and light. The very air itself still felt charged to her. If she closed her eyes she could see those curtains of red and waves of blue crashing against one another, like waves against a shore. The boy will become more powerful than either of us. Never. Fool. You've already lost. Celeste shuddered, wishing not for the first time that this room had been sealed. Instead cordoning off the area as one would expect of the Jedi Council, the Supreme Chancellor's office had become something of a grand tourist attraction for the Coruscanti people. To this day, it was still something of a scandal that a Sith had wormed his way into the position of Supreme Chancellor. Small wonder that half the galaxy would still use it as gossip a decade later. She could still feel the lingering traces of the dark side in the adjoining room if she focused intensely. Such evil, and yet it had been silenced by Naruto. Hadn't it? Credit for your thoughts. Celeste started, suddenly aware of the blonde in question at her side. Blue eyes the color of endless oceans regarded her curiously. Where's the Chancellor? She frowned. Discussing politics with Qui-Gon. Naruto thumbed over his shoulder to where Bail could be seen, conversing with the man in question. It seems we're going to have help on this job. 2 Jedi. Well, a Jedi and a half if you count this Padawan thing. He paused, considering his own words. You, gonna be alright with that. Celeste found herself chewing her lip. Qui-Gon and Isla were no longer Jedi in the true sense of the word. She'd been evading the Council's summons ever since they realized she was alive, and now she would soon find herself in the company of 2 of the Order she'd been striving so hard to avoid. Though, she didn't know how she would feel. Not at all. Warily, she dodged the question. So this is it, then. The words felt awkward and forced, even for her. By the Force she was bad at this. This is where you saw him fall. Even so, she dared press the point. She had to know the truth. Sidious. Just about. He ceded with an ashen look. Hardest fight of my life. No, wait. Second. Those witches on Dathomir were the worst. I don't understand you. Naruto snorted quietly. Me. I'm just your average, ramen-loving. Celeste turned sharply, smacking him full in the face with her braid. Naruto guffawed loudly, laughing. Oh, can't you be serious for once in your life? Dismayed, she reached up and pinched the Mandalore's cheek, eliciting another yelp. Still, Naruto didn't stop laughing. Honestly, it was like talking to a child, sometimes. Even after 10 years, I still don't understand you. I'm amazed you haven't gone to the dark side. It was meant as a jest, but she realized her mistake as soon as she'd said it. Naruto stopped laughing, lowered his head. Curious, she followed his gaze, glimpsing a tiny rock in his hand. You know, he murmured quietly, when I discovered these powers, the Force, when I first found I could do these things, his hand twitched, and the pebble rose upward. I won't lie, I was tempted. Suddenly I could move things with my mind, bend others to my will, wield a sword despite never swinging one a day before in my life. Added to my other gifts than everything Django taught me, and I was pretty damn close to going on a power trip for a while, there. What stopped you? My family. The response was almost instantaneous. I have people who care about me. It keeps me grounded, no matter what I become. I mean, the blonde continued with a spin, laughing, look at me. Have you seen what I can do? I can bring back the dead, survive a shot to the head. I yanked a ship out of the sky. I can even fly. If that doesn't make an human, I don't know what does. He turned and she followed his gaze yet again, frowning as she caught sight of the source of his ire. The Jedi Temple loomed in the distance, an ancient obelisk to days past. Wanna visit? I don't know. Her voice was small. I fear they wouldn't even accept me, I've changed too much. A hand rose, tracing the glass, the spire in the distance. It felt as if she could just reach out and touch it. Is it wrong that I still feel obligated? We each have our duties to ourselves, Cell. Naruto looked back at her and she started at the nickname as much as his expression, for his visage was oddly intent. Those eerie blue eyes boring into her. Cell, you don't need them to validate your existence. You are what you are. This idiot. Celeste felt her face burn beneath the unexpected praise, her once staid boldness retreating inward. She fidgeted in place, restless beneath his gaze. When she felt him draw closer, she nearly bolted. What in blazes did he think was doing, standing so close? What are you going to do when it's over? Don't know. Naruto uttered a jaw-popping yawn. The fool once more. Settle down. Let somebody else be Mandalore. Have lots of kids. Maybe even grow old, finally. You don't have a single gray hair. The ghost of a smile played across her lips. Give it a few centuries. Her shoulders trembled, and the laughter tasted false in her mouth. Why did she laugh when she felt like crying? This wasn't her planet, wasn't her home. And yet now that she was here it hurt. It hurt knowing that all she'd ever known was gone, replaced by a faded ghost she didn't recognize. It hurt so damn much and she didn't know what to do with it all. With him, herself, this planet, with these emotions. You going to tell me what's wrong? What? She sputtered. Nothing's, Celeste. I'm lost. The words slipped through before she could think to stop them. There wasn't so much as a touch of anger in his voice when he'd spoke her name, yet something in them compelled her to speak her mind. I feel out of place, like I've been left behind. I'm a relic from a forgotten age, I know that, all right. Angry tears gathered in her eyes as she swung away from him. Make no mistake, I'm grateful for all you've done. It's just, I thought I could do this. I thought I could be a part of your group and remain a Jedi, remain detached. But aw, geez, don't cry. Strong arms encircled her, and without thinking, Celeste melted into the sudden embrace. For a precious second, a silver of eternity, the ancient Jedi felt safe, warm, content. All her fears and insecurities slipped away one by, replaced by a staid calm. Even then, she refused to let the fears fall. Pure will held them on her lashes until they finally dried, until she trusted herself enough to breathe again and not sink beneath the wave of her own depression. I want to see the temple, she said at last, her words muffled into his chest. When this is over, I want to see these new Jedi and know them for what they are. Sure, swear to me, she demanded. Swear you'll take me there. He gave her an odd look. I swear. Hell, I'll even promise if it makes you feel better. A hand rose, and he smiled merrily. I, the mighty Mandalore, do so swear upon penalty of death that I will let you see the Jedi Temple with me at your side. I think that ought to cover it. Good. You can let go now. Naruto jerked back, abashed. Look, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Don't be, she muttered. I like your hugs. He seemed to consider that a moment, blue eyes growing distant. We should probably go. Stay, she whispered softly. So he did. End flashback. A loud crash jarred her back to reality. Statement, this is absurd. HK-47 declared aloud, indignant as he slammed the butt of his blaster against the hull. The master is the epitome of a killing machine. Addendum, he would never be killed by a lesser meatbag. Had anyone else waved a blaster of that caliber about, they would have found themselves riddled full of holes. As it were, the droid's furious gesticulating earned him more than a few irate looks. Then perhaps you can explain where he's gone. Qui-Gon's voice was steely. We haven't heard from him since he went after Jango. The droid bristled, red eyes burning furiously. Statement, watch your tone, Jedi meatbag. The master may tolerate you, but I am not so lenient. Continue to insult him and you won't live to regret it. Gray eyes slid toward the outraged droid. And what is that supposed to mean? It means you can't go flying off the handle. Irritated rebuttal, you forget my programming, Jedi. HK's bright, amber orbs seemed to blaze within the carapace of his skull. I was made to terminate lesser meatbags, including the likes of you. Eager suggestion, perhaps you would care to test me. HK was fast. Qui-Gon was faster still. VCCM. The green blade of his lightsaber sprang into life almost without him touching the control at all. In the next instant HK-47 opened fire. Qui-Gon swept his arm around in a clean arc that directed the blaster bolt down into the floor and bisected the offending weapon in one sweep. Hot shrapnel sizzled on his robe and the floor, but the rogue Jedi seemed to feel nothing. His gaze remained firmly fixated on the irritated droid before him. The hunter-killer unit took one look at his ruined weapon and snarled. Threat, you'll regret that, meatbag. Exterminating with extreme prejudice. Stop, stop, stop. SHMI thrusts herself between man and machine before they can come to further blows, nearly impaling herself on the Jedi's blazing weapon in process. Both of you, Qui-Gon, put the saber down. HK, no disintegrations. I know you're angry, but this isn't the way. Furious declaration, damn it, meatbag woman. The master is not dead. Eyes like angry diamonds cut to him, blazing. But if he was, would this honor his memory? HK slumped. Regretful admission, no. Then, stop. I apologize as well. Qui-Gon seemed to deflate as well, lowering his saber and thumbing it off. This is not becoming of me. A look of silent shame flitted across his leonine features. SHMI watched them a moment longer, droid and Jedi, stepping away only when she was certain they wouldn't come to blows. The tension remained, however, a rubber band stretched taut, ready to snap at a moment's notice. Compared to their tense argument, other reactions were more explosive. Wookiee on the loose. SHMI glides effortlessly out of the way as a ruined, dented sabak table hurls through the air she'd been occupying. She's just enough time to hear the startled exclamations of Qui-Gon and the others before it whistles past, crashing loudly against one of the Konoha's many walls. Only one individual possesses brute strength of that caliber. Growlarg. Hey, I wasn't blaming you, buddy. Come on, don't throw anything else. Anakin yelped as Char barreled out of the hold in a rush, a furry freight train of claws and fur and fangs. One looking at the departing form of the Wookiee told her all she needed to know. Tempers were flaring, boiling over. Naruto had been the glue that held them together, and without him, they were falling apart. Not just the crew. Indeed, the mood on the Konoha was decidedly bleak. They'd gathered here, back at the ship, the only safe place they knew. Tempers were left to flare, blame was exchanged, old grudges left to fester quietly. And in the silence that followed, they were left to debate what happened, what went wrong. Not for the first time, she wondered if bringing the Jedi in on this was a good idea. Naruto had been against the backup at first, but in the end, Qui-Gon had prevailed. Obi-Wan seemed a decent enough sort from what she remembered of him, and though his Padawan Ahsoka was still a little wet behind the ears, she seemed to share in her master's compassion. There was a certain indefatigable innocence about the young Togruta, a purity one would be hard-pressed to find these days. She'd been kind enough to Anakin and the twins even before this mission went sideways, in any case. And she still was now, dithering aimlessly in a corner with the girls while the rest of them dithered over what to do next. What could they do next? Where did we go wrong? What do we do now? A muscle jumped in her jaw at the thought. One would think that with 4 rogue force users, a Jedi and his Padawan, coupled with an hunter-killer unit and a Wookiee, it would be easy. Then there was herself vet and set, not to mention the Mandalore himself no less. They outnumbered their enemy. It should have been easy. Find the one trying to kill Senator Amidala, make him talk, kill the ones behind it and make it home in time for supper. It was a standard setup, 3 to guard the Senator, 3 on the rooftops, and 3 more on the ground. A drill they'd run hundreds of times. Everything should have gone according to plan. Instead, something had gone horribly wrong, and now they were trying to pick up the pieces of their failed operation. Somehow they'd been outplayed. Padme had been shot, Naruto had yet to report back, and in his absence, some had begun to fear for the worst. Coupled by the fact that he'd all but shut himself off from the Force, making him impossible to track, and you had a recipe for disaster, which led to the blaming game unfolding before her. Why didn't you follow him? You were there, Ayla was exclaiming when Shmi finally returned to the hold, spitting curses in a language she didn't recognize. The Twi'lek positively vibrated with tension as she verbally dressed down Obi-Wan the tip of her leku writhing as though they were alive, angry and distressed. And what was I supposed to do? Leave her? He shot back. We had Jango's accomplice in custody, until she killed herself. I said she was poisoned. That a load of bantha poodoo and you know it. Let's all calm down. Calm? Enough. Shmi hadn't been watching Celeste at all this entire time. She hadn't seen the need. Hadn't seen the ex-Jedi's face continue to darken as the conversation began its inevitable downward spiral into blaming one another. She hadn't seen her raise her head, that her once blank countenance growing increasingly perturbed the longer the argument looked on. And she certainly had not seen her face. That's enough. Her words a snarl. The Jedi ignited her lightsaber and forcibly discharged a blast of lightning into the ceiling with a loud crackle. Do I have your attention now? Everyone recoiled, even Shmi. That was when she saw it. The eyes. Now, as Celeste lurched to her feet, Shmi could literally see the molten gold in her gaze, not that of a Sith, but close, dangerously close. The eyes of a woman who was neither of the dark nor light, but somewhere in between. Those furious storm clouds, still brewing under a furrowed brow. A part of Shmi understood Morn's anger, felt it herself. That brooding emotion that bordered somewhere between anger and despair, it was nearly overwhelming by itself. That made her dangerous enough on its own. And Celeste had the Force, not to mention the strange connection she shared with Naruto. Her morals lay in a decidedly gray area. He's not dead. When Morn spoke, Tiwa's a whisper. What are you talking about? Obi-Wan inquired. I said he's not dead, you scruffy nerf herder. Celeste continued, her voice cracking like a whip as she addressed the. You didn't see him die. You said so yourself. She snarled at Obi-Wan, thrusting her finger against his chest. You didn't feel it. Every word came in a sharp jab of that single, solitary digit, visibly driving the larger man back. If he was gone, we would know. I would know. Then, he's either badly wounded or missing. Qui-Gon replied, choosing his words with infinite care as those eerie eyes snapped towards him. Regardless, he should have contacted us by now. Hours ago. I don't like this either, but we have to face the very real possibility that something might have happened. Probably the former. Obi-Wan offered. A muscle jumped in Celeste's jaw. But beyond that, the Blackette remained eerily still. Ahsoka hesitantly piped up. Maybe he really is Diak. She never finished that sentence, because in that instant Morn made a fist with her hand. Do not question me, youngling. The words were a frigid hiss. He's alive. I know it. I feel him. Then how is it that no one else can? Morn's jaw clenched. I just can. Shmi. Watch it. Ayla and Qui-Gon were already rising, prepared to stave off the ancient Jedi's outbursts. But instead of flinging them halfway across the room, the Jedi shadow crumpled. Snatching up her saber staff, the former master stormed out of the room. He isn't dead, you ass. I'll prove it. Shmi followed the scene with her eyes and fought the urge to follow. She wanted to believe that Naruto was alive. He'd taken worse shots in the field and kept going. But he'd been gone for too long without checking in, and he'd left explicit instructions as to what that meant. Something was wrong. So no, as much as she might wish it, she couldn't follow them. Besides, the twins needed her. How the hell had this happened? Only 5 hours before, their group had been safe and whole. Safe, whole. Something snapped. We're going after him. We don't even know where to look. Then we'll have to start. Without another word, she stormed towards the cockpit. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 5. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author NeonZangetsu on FANFICTIONnet. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.